Hello, fellow Sapiens. Before we begin, slow down a little. Let your thoughts settle. Whether you're lying in bed, driving through the night, cooking, or just trying to quiet your mind, this space is for that. Welcome to Sleepless Homo, soft science for sleepless thinkers. Here, history, archaeology, and biology are told slowly, without noise or arrogance. Just humble researchers, deep time, and quiet curiosity. If you find calm in this kind of storytelling, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other tired minds discover a little peace through knowledge. Tell me in the comments how you listen, before sleep, while working, or with headphones in the dark. And if you drift off, there are timestamps waiting for you when you wake. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. A small fire flickers at the mouth of a limestone cave. It's the end of the Ice Age, somewhere around 13,000 years before our time. The glaciers that once ruled the world are retreating, and in the hills of what we now call northern Israel, a group of people gathers inside a place known today as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐾𝐒. They have hunted, gathered, and buried their dead here for generations, but tonight they're doing something new. Something that, by accident or by intention, will leave chemical traces still detectable in the soil thousands of years later. The first known evidence of fermentation. The story of this discovery begins not with a celebration, but with a damp mistake. In the stone mortars carved into the cave floor, someone soaked wild barley and wheat, cereals they had gathered from the slopes outside. Perhaps they meant to soften the grains for a porridge, or to grind them into something edible during a lean season. But when the mixture sat too long in the warm air, yeasts, those invisible single-celled drifters that float through every ecosystem, began to feed on the sugars. Within days, the water turned cloudy, bubbling softly as carbon dioxide escaped. The people who tasted it may have been curious or cautious. Either way, they learned something that night. That time, moisture, and warmth could transform grain into something far stranger than food. What they stumbled upon was one of the quietest biochemical miracles in nature. Fermentation is metabolism at its most ancient, a process older than oxygen itself, older than multicellular life. Yeast convert sugars into alcohol and gas, not to serve us but to survive. Yet for humans, this reaction unlocked a new kind of experience. Taste, warmth, and the peculiar lightness of mind that follows the first sip. For the Natufians of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐾𝐒, this transformation must have seemed alive, almost magical. They had turned grass into spirit. Archaeologists found the evidence only recently. In the stone mortars of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐾𝐒, microscopic residue still clings to the rough interior walls, crushed grains, yeast cells, starches partially digested by enzymes. Radiocarbon dating places them near 13,000 BCE, centuries before the first fields, before pottery, before writing. The traces suggest that the grains were mashed, heated, and left to ferment in pits or stone basins. When analysed under a scanning electron microscope, the patterns matched those left by brewing rather than by baking. This wasn't bread gone wrong, it was a recipe. To understand how extraordinary that is, it helps to know who the Natufians were. They lived at the boundary between worlds, the last great hunter-gatherers of the Levant standing on the threshold of agriculture but not yet farmers. They built semi-permanent houses, collected wild cereals, and buried their dead with flowers and beads. Their society was complex but still nomadic in rhythm. For them to make beer, or proto-beer, meant organising time and labour around a process that required patience and collaboration. Someone had to collect the right grains, someone else had to soak, mash and watch. And when it was done, the result wasn't stored for survival, it was consumed together. The most likely setting for this early fermentation was a feast, a communal ritual marking death or renewal. Archaeologists have found burials in 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐾𝐒 surrounded by wildflowers, indicating care and ceremony. Nearby, the mortars used for brewing sit within the same cave system. This suggests that drinking and mourning may have been linked. If so, alcohol began as an act of remembrance, a liquid shared between the living and the dead, binding a community through something more than hunger. Chemically, this drink would have been thick, sour and low in alcohol. Nothing like modern beer. It would spoil quickly, making it unsuitable for storage. But its value wasn't in preservation, it was in presence. fermentation produces not just alcohol but aroma, warmth, and a sense of togetherness. To gather around a bowl of this strange, bubbling mixture was to share something transformed by time and care, a gesture that said, "We are still here." What makes this discovery even more fascinating is that it predates agriculture itself. These people were not cultivating barley or wheat yet, they were foraging it. This means the first brewers in history didn't have farms, only curiosity. The grains they used were wild, unpredictable, and variable in sugar content. Every batch would have been different, every taste a surprise. Yet this unpredictability might have been part of the appeal. The process demanded attention and memory. It rewarded experimentation. In that way, fermentation may have been humanity's first laboratory, a safe space for trial and error, long before writing or measurement. And yeast, that microscopic alchemist, was the perfect collaborator. It existed everywhere, on plant skins, in the air, in the soil underfoot. The Natufians didn't need to understand microbiology. They only needed to notice that soaked grains left to rest could become alive. Over generations, they would have recognized patterns. Warmth accelerated the bubbling, cold slowed it. Smoke or ash might change the flavor. The more they paid attention, the more predictable the magic became. Through observation, they domesticated a chemical process, one of the earliest forms of scientific thinking. This raises an unsettling question. What came first, the bread or the beer? For decades, archaeologists assumed that agriculture began to feed the body. But Rakfet and similar sites suggest another motive. Some researchers argue that humans may have cultivated cereals initially not for food, but for fermentation. In other words, the urge to celebrate may have preceded the urge to settle. If that's true, then our species learned to party before it learned to plant. Of course, we can't know their thoughts. No carvings or songs remain. What we do have are residues, the faint chemical fingerprints of yeast and maltose, the ghost of a shared experience. When scientists recreated the process in the lab, using similar tools and grains, they produced a cloudy beverage with a complex flavour and a faint intoxicating effect. It wasn't enough to cause chaos, but perhaps enough to make a long night feel warmer, or a farewell less final. There's something deeply human about that. To discover a new sensory world by accident, to taste transformation, and then to repeat it, that's curiosity turning into culture. Fermentation is the first technology that required surrender. You set up the conditions, then wait. You can't rush it. You can only trust that something invisible will happen. In a way, that patience mirrors the structure of early communities. Cooperation was necessary. No one person could claim the outcome. The product belonged to everyone who waited. It's tempting to imagine the scene. The flicker of torchlight on wet stone, the smell of grain and smoke, the soft hum of conversation while they waited for the drink to settle, and when they finally lifted their cups, perhaps carved from bone or wood, they tasted not just the brew but each other's labour. Every sip was a reminder that life could be transformed, that even death could ferment into memory. Modern science has reconstructed much of this story through chemical analysis, but the emotion remains guesswork. What did the first drink mean to a world without writing? Maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was escape. Maybe, in a time when the world itself was thawing, fermentation became a metaphor for change. The idea that things could decay and yet become something new. From a biochemical standpoint, the discovery of fermentation is an extension of the microbial world into human consciousness. Yeasts had been fermenting sugars for billions of years before we arrived. All we did was notice. But noticing changed everything. Once we understood that natural processes could be guided, not just feared, we began to see chemistry as partnership. That insight would echo through millennia, from brewing to bread, from cheese to antibiotics. In Rakfet Cave, that insight was still raw, almost accidental. Yet it set in motion a new kind of community. Fermentation required gatherings. It encouraged surplus. It invited storytelling, waiting, and laughter. It made memory tasteable. Long before rulers or temples, this was how humans united, not through conquest, but through sharing something that time had improved. When archaeologists published their findings in 2018, the scientific world paused. The residue they'd found wasn't the earliest evidence of agriculture, but it was the earliest evidence of brewing. In the timeline of human innovation, that inversion is profound. It suggests that culture, in the literal microbial sense, may have been the root of civilization. We gathered not just to survive, but to create conditions where invisible life could work for us. The thought is both humbling and strangely comforting, that our first collective invention wasn't a weapon or a wall, but a yeast. It didn't divide, it blended, it didn't conquer, it connected. To ferment was to trust the unseen, a small act of faith in a chaotic world. And maybe that's why, even now, the act of raising a glass feels ancient. Somewhere deep in our species' memory, we remember that first bubbling bowl in a cave, the laughter echoing off the rock, and the realization that we could make transformation part of who we are. So perhaps the first discovery that truly united humans wasn't fire after all, but fermentation. A quiet, invisible spark that taught us how to wait, how to share, and how to celebrate being together in a world that was just beginning to warm. A planet that once held a thriving population of early humans suddenly empties. Across the vast plains of Africa and the coasts of Arabia, most campfires go dark. A few groups cling to survival, scattered, quiet, unaware that they are now the only carriers of a fragile genetic future. Between 120,000 and 80,000 years before our time, the entire species of Homo sapiens may have dwindled to numbers smaller than the crowd in a football stadium. Some genetic models suggest fewer than 10,000 breeding adults. Others propose an even narrower count, perhaps just a few thousand individuals left to hold the line against extinction. For a moment measured in tens of millennia, we were one drought, one epidemic, one unlucky season away from disappearing forever. This period, sometimes called the late Pleistocene bottleneck, is not a story of disaster we remember, but one our DNA quietly records. Every human alive today descends from those survivors, a sliver of the original genetic variety once present in Africa's vast populations of early Homo sapiens. When scientists began sequencing mitochondrial DNA in the late 20th century, they found evidence of an ancestral narrowing. Genetic diversity among humans was shockingly low compared to that of other great apes. For example, chimpanzees possess several times more genetic variation than the entire modern human species. Something had reduced our gene pool to a whisper. The evidence points to environmental and demographic stress rather than a single catastrophic event. Africa during this window was a continent of extremes. Climate records extracted from ocean sediments and cave speleothems show abrupt oscillations between wet and arid phases. Monsoon systems weakened, deserts expanded. Lakes that had once nourished vast ecosystems vanished into dust. As grasslands contracted, so did the animals that fed early humans. Population models derived from ancient DNA coalescence suggest a prolonged reduction in effective population size lasting tens of thousands of years. In simple terms, that means the number of individuals reproducing successfully over generations stayed critically low for a very long time. These were not small families huddled in one place, but small worlds scattered far apart. Each group, perhaps numbering only a few hundred individuals, lived in isolation from others for centuries at a time. Migration corridors that once allowed gene flow closed under drought. The Red Sea narrowed the link between Africa and Arabia, while the Sahara cut across the north like a barrier of stone and sand. In eastern Africa, a few habitable refuges may have persisted near highland lakes and coastal estuaries. Genetic diversity patterns today still echo those refugees. The deepest branches of human ancestry trace to regions in southern and eastern Africa, where populations could have endured through the dry chaos. What makes this story remarkable is not the hardship, but the improbability of survival. Small populations face what evolutionary biologists call genetic drift, random fluctuations that erase variation over time. In a group of just a few thousand, each birth or death can shift the frequency of genetic traits dramatically. Harmful mutations spread more easily, beneficial ones can vanish by chance, and inbreeding becomes inevitable. Over generations, this can lead to reduced fertility, weaker immunity, and developmental defects. The fact that Homo sapiens emerged from such a bottleneck without apparent long-term collapse suggests that natural selection and sheer luck work together. The fossil record from this period is sparse, partly because the survivors were few and often mobile, yet a handful of sites preserve glimpses of what these people endured. In southern Africa, layers at Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave show intermittent occupation, phases of human activity separated by long absences, perhaps corresponding to times when the coastlines shrank or resources failed. Charred shells and pigments hint at innovation even under pressure, but the continuity is broken. People came, adapted and left again, over and over, as if testing the planet's patience. Elsewhere, in the Horn of Africa and parts of Arabia, isolated populations may have tried to expand northward during brief humid phases, only to be pushed back when aridity returned. Each failed migration would have thinned the population further. Genetic models show that by around 80,000 years ago, the effective population size, the number of individuals contributing genes to the next generation, may have been as low as 1 or 2,000. If that model is accurate, it would mean that nearly every person alive today descends from a network of families small enough to fit within a few interconnected villages. There are debates, of course. Not every scientist agrees on the depth or duration of the bottleneck. Some argue that our ancestors may have been divided into several moderately sized populations rather than one tiny one. Others suggest regional fluctuations. While one group declined, another prospered temporarily elsewhere. The genetic signal we detect today might be an average of these shifting patterns. The truth is likely complex, a patchwork of expansions and contractions, each leaving faint traces in the genome. But all reconstructions share one sobering conclusion. For a long stretch of prehistory, humanity's existence hung by a thread. Why does this matter? Because such small numbers reshape the story of human nature. Many of the traits we associate with our species, cooperation, long-term memory, empathy, may have been sharpened during this crisis. In small bands, survival depended on mutual aid. A failed hunter or an injured gatherer could doom not only themselves but the genetic future of the group. Those who shared, who cared for children not their own, who maintained trust beyond immediate kin, may have left more descendants. Compassion could have been an adaptive trait born from scarcity. Yet it was still a biological strategy, not a cultural philosophy. Morality had not yet been invented. These people were surviving, not sermonizing. The bottleneck also explains our startling genetic uniformity today. Modern humans, whether living in Greenland or Papua New Guinea, share more than 99.9% of their DNA sequence. Two random humans on opposite sides of the world are genetically closer than two chimpanzees from neighbouring forests. That sameness is a fingerprint of near extinction. It means that somewhere deep in time, we were all reduced to one small breeding pool. The diversity we see now, in languages, cultures and skin tones, is a recent explosion layered over a genetic foundation built by survivors who barely numbered in the thousands. To put this into perspective, consider that a typical troop of savanna baboons can include up to 100 individuals. Multiply that by a few dozen troops across a region, and you already exceed the total effective population size of early Homo sapiens during its narrowest squeeze. We were at one point an endangered species not by choice but by climate, and yet we persisted. This persistence likely came from versatility rather than dominance. The humans of this time were generalists, capable of eating varied diets, exploiting shellfish, plants, and small game. Their adaptability allowed scattered populations to hang on where specialists might have perished. Some geneticists propose that this period acted as an evolutionary filter, removing lineages that could not adjust quickly enough, leaving behind those predisposed to flexibility and cooperation. If true, then our entire psychological toolkit for surviving uncertainty may have been forged during these quiet centuries of near disappearance. We often imagine evolutionary success as expansion, but here it meant restraint, small numbers, careful resource use, and patience. When climate improved again around 70,000 years ago, these tiny populations began to grow. Genetic diversity started to rise slowly as groups reconnected, but even then the scars of the bottleneck remained. Certain immune genes show signs of ancient selection pressures, hinting at diseases that swept through small, immunologically naive populations. The fragility of early humans was biological, not moral. They were simply too few to make mistakes. What we learn from studying this era is that the idea of humanity as a unified species was once fiction. There was no global identity, only scattered enclaves of survival. If a visitor from another world had surveyed Earth around 90,000 years ago, they might have concluded that Homo sapiens was already doomed, an experiment winding down. But within those fragile groups, every child born carried a statistical miracle, the continuation of a lineage stretching back 2 million years. Each successful birth was an act of defiance against entropy. Geneticists today still refine the numbers, running computer simulations that combine mutation rates, population size, and recombination data. Depending on the parameters, the bottleneck might have lasted anywhere from a few thousand to 30,000 years. The precision doesn't matter as much as the lesson. Survival at such low numbers is extraordinarily rare in mammals. Most species that reach such lows vanish. We didn't. And that defiance, more than any later achievement, may be the defining fact of our existence. When we look at the fossilized faces of our ancestors from this period, rare fragments of skulls found in caves from Ethiopia to Morocco, we're not seeing a triumphant species. We're seeing the lucky few who managed to outwait extinction. They lived and died without knowing that their descendants would one day cover the planet. Their world was local, their struggles immediate, their victories microscopic. But through them, the continuity of Homo sapiens endured. In the end, the late Pleistocene bottleneck is not a tragedy, but a threshold. It marks the moment when humanity's story nearly stopped, and by continuing changed its tempo forever. Everything that followed, migration, culture, language, art, rests on the survival of those few thousand individuals who weathered the droughts and carried our genes forward. The silence of that age still echoes in us, a biological memory of having been almost gone. Imagine this. The world has warmed again after the long drought, but for humans it is still a quiet, narrow place. Somewhere in East Africa, a small band of Homo sapiens wakes beneath a rocky overhang. There are fewer than 50 of them, maybe fewer than 30. Every face in the campfire's glow is familiar. Every scar, every voice, every story. In a group this small, there are no strangers. Every child's parent is someone's cousin. Every grandparent has buried the same people, eaten the same roots, and walked the same trails for generations. In this kind of world, family is no longer an idea. It is the only reality there is. For scientists trying to understand what life looked like between 80,000 and 60,000 years before the present, these small bands are the most likely model. Genetics tells us that after the Great Bottleneck, humans lived in tiny scattered populations across Africa. Each group may have numbered only a few dozen, bound together by blood, habit and necessity. They hunted, gathered and shared, but they did not meet many others. Across hundreds of kilometres, there might have been only a handful of neighbouring groups, too far to visit often, too risky to travel between. In this isolation, the meaning of kinship became everything. It defined who you trusted, who you cared for, and who you could not afford to love. Modern biology gives us clues to what this meant. In social animals, close inbreeding brings visible costs, reduced fertility, weaker offspring, and higher mortality. Nature has developed countless safeguards against it. Many primate species, for example, avoid mating within their immediate family through instinct and dispersal. Young male chimpanzees remain in their birth group, but females leave when they mature seeking new communities. In other species, the pattern reverses. Among gorillas, a dominant male may lead a harem, but when his sons grow old enough, they are driven out to find unrelated mates elsewhere. These are not moral systems, they are evolutionary mechanisms for maintaining genetic health. Humans likely shared similar instincts. Even in small groups, individuals could recognize familiar faces, scents, and voices, cues that signal kinship. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers and primates show that social recognition alone can limit inbreeding. Yet when populations are small and isolation is long, instincts are not enough. Over time, everyone becomes related to everyone else. The question then is not whether to avoid inbreeding, but whether it is even possible. In those narrow centuries of survival, the line between adaptation and risk blurred. Anthropologists estimate that a group of about 50 individuals can remain viable for several generations without severe inbreeding, but only if there is occasional gene flow from outside. for the humans of this era, that trickle of new DNA may have come from wandering individuals, from brief contacts during seasonal migrations, or from rare exchanges between neighbouring bands. But those encounters were rare, precious exceptions in a world of familiarity. For most, marriage, if we can use that word, meant choosing among cousins. From a biological standpoint, that kind of reproduction brings both cost and creativity. Inbreeding can expose harmful recessive genes, but it can also concentrate useful ones temporarily. Some scientists think that small, isolated populations may have accelerated the refinement of certain traits, cognitive, immunological, or metabolic, that later spread when groups reconnected. Evolution is messy that way. What weakens a species in one context can sometimes prepare it for change in another. Still, life in such close circles must have been fragile. Every illness, every injury, every infertile pairing would echo through the next generation. To imagine the social reality of this, picture a life lived within one long conversation, a community where everyone knows everyone's lineage, disputes, and loyalties. Knowledge of ancestry would not have been abstract but immediate. Who your parents were, and their parents before them, determined where you slept, what you ate, and whom you could approach. Kinship was the original architecture of society, built not on choice but on survival. There was no written genealogy, only memory carried in song and story. Even today, in small-scale societies that echo ancient structures, kinship terms often extend far beyond nuclear families. Anthropologists working with modern hunter-gatherers find networks of fictive kin, people treated as relatives through custom rather than blood. This suggests that the idea of broadening family ties emerged early, perhaps as a defense against the limits of small group life. When everyone around you is technically kin, redefining family becomes an act of necessity. It may have been one of the first cultural responses to the genetic trap of isolation, not yet exogamy, but an early flexibility in how humans imagine belonging. But most of the time, biology enforced its rules. Inbreeding depression, the cumulative effect of harmful gene pairing, can reduce reproductive success dramatically after just a few generations. For mammals, this can mean smaller litters, weaker immune systems, or congenital deformities. Fossil evidence is limited, but several Pleistocene human skulls show developmental anomalies consistent with small population genetics. These are not proofs, but hints. Thin bone walls, asymmetrical features, minor deformities that tell us these were not large, healthy populations. It was a precarious balance between survival and self-limitation. We can also infer from animal behavior what social life might have looked like. In primates, grooming and alliance networks hold small groups together under stress. Among early humans, similar social mechanisms, touch, shared food, play, likely acted as glue. Emotional intelligence may have been the hidden advantage that allowed humans to maintain harmony within claustrophobic communities. When your entire world fits within sight of the same fire, conflict management becomes a survival skill. Those with empathy, patience, or humour may have found more mates, not because of moral superiority, but because they made life bearable in confinement. Daily life would have been repetitive but intimate. Children grew up surrounded by the same adults their entire lives. Generations overlapped in the same shelters, passing on skills directly. There was no anonymity. A child's mistakes were everyone's problem, an elder's knowledge was everyone's inheritance. In such settings, social bonds and genetics intertwined until the distinction blurred. Family was not just who shared your genes, but who shared your survival. What did love mean in a world this small? Probably not what it means now. Affection and partnership were bound to function more like ecological contracts than romantic choices. Pairings were negotiated around resource sharing and trust, not novelty. But even so, tenderness must have existed. The quiet familiarity of people who had known each other since birth, raising children together because there was no one else to raise them. The earliest forms of companionship were likely forged in these limited circles, under the pressure of knowing that every relationship mattered to the group's endurance. One of the enduring mysteries of this period is how humans avoided complete genetic collapse. If everyone was related, what kept the species viable? Part of the answer lies in natural mobility. Even small groups likely moved seasonally, following herds or plant cycles. Over hundreds of years, these slow drifts could bring distant groups into indirect contact, allowing minimal but vital gene exchange. A single outsider joining a community could refresh genetic diversity for generations. To them, it was just a new companion. To evolution, it was salvation. This fragile dance between isolation and contact defines much of our early biology. It explains why human populations from this era appear both uniform and distinct. Each group carried a subset of the total genetic library, shaped by drift and chance. When climate later improved and migrations resumed, these genetic islands began to merge again. But during the long pause between 80 and 60,000 years ago, each island evolved in near solitude. The social consequences of this are profound. When life depends on kin, cooperation becomes instinctive, but so does suspicion of outsiders. The emotional architecture of us versus them may have been born not from competition, but from the sheer comfort of familiarity. Evolution favoured those who could bond deeply with close kin, because kin were all they had. That bias would later shape everything from tribe to nation. The genetic intimacy of small bands etched social instincts that still govern us: loyalty, empathy, but also xenophobia and fear of the unknown. These are not moral failings. They are echoes of a time when trusting a stranger could have meant risking extinction. Still, within these constraints, human adaptability persisted. Even with limited options, populations found ways to avoid the worst outcomes of inbreeding. Behavioural flexibility, rotating partnerships, adopting orphaned children, sharing childcare across extended families, may have diffused genetic risk indirectly. These strategies are observed in many modern primate species, suggesting they have deep evolutionary roots. In that sense, social behaviour itself became a genetic defence mechanism. Where migration failed, empathy filled the gap. It is difficult to overstate how narrow that corridor of survival was. Each small band carried the same genetic fragility we discussed earlier, but now it had become a social ecosystem. If one group felt a disease or accident, an entire lineage could vanish. Every new birth was an improbable success, every healthy child a triumph of biology against mathematics. And yet, through tens of thousands of such moments, humanity endured. What remains for us today is not just the evidence of their DNA, but the emotional architecture that formed under those conditions. The craving for closeness, the fear of isolation, the need to belong, all have roots in these ancient kinship loops. Long before we built civilizations or wrote songs about loneliness, we lived its biological version. We were species-level introverts forced into cooperation by necessity. When you think of that tiny band under the African stars, each face a reflection of the same bloodline, you can almost feel the tension of existence too small to fail. Every gesture mattered. Every relationship carried the weight of the future. They could not know that one day billions of descendants would debate their story, sequence their genes, and marvel at how they survived. For them, survival itself was meaning enough. Imagine this. A cold wind moves through the mountains of southern Siberia. In a limestone chamber above a frozen valley, a young woman dies. Her bones are buried by the slow drift of time, and for nearly 50,000 years she sleeps inside that cave, a tiny piece of the Neanderthal world preserved in silence. When scientists find her remains in the 21st century, they name the site Denisova Cave, after a local hermit, but the woman they uncover belongs to a different story entirely. Her genome, extracted from a fragment of finger bone, will reveal something astonishing and tragic about our closest relatives, that by the end of their existence the Neanderthals were breeding within circles far too small to survive. When her DNA was sequenced, the results stunned geneticists. The Altai Neanderthal, as she's now known, carried regions of the genome that were nearly identical on both copies of each chromosome. This pattern, called homozygosity, is the genetic fingerprint of inbreeding. It means that her parents were as closely related as half-siblings, or an uncle and his niece, or a grandparent and a grandchild. In a population large enough to mix genes widely, such pairing would be almost impossible. But in a community reduced to a few families, it becomes inevitable. The genome told a story written not in myth, but in math, a lineage trapped within itself. The timing of her life, between 60 and 50,000 years before our present, places her near the final chapters of Neanderthal existence. Across Eurasia, their range stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Altai Mountains, yet that vast territory was not densely populated. Fossil and genetic evidence suggests that Neanderthals lived in scattered groups, rarely exceeding a few dozen individuals. For hundreds of thousands of years they had endured ice age cycles by adapting locally, maintaining small, stable populations suited to their environments. But isolation, the same force that once protected them, would also become their undoing. Modern population genetics helps explain why. In small groups, the random loss of genetic variation, called drift, erodes diversity faster than selection can restore it. Over time, harmful recessive mutations accumulate. When individuals who share these mutations reproduce, the likelihood of expressing genetic defects rises sharply. This is not visible at first. It creeps in generation by generation, weakening immunity, lowering fertility, and reducing the odds of long-term survival. In the Altai Neanderthal genome, scientists found long stretches of DNA identical on both maternal and paternal sides, an unmistakable signature that her population had been small and inbred for many generations. To visualize what that means, imagine a family tree with its branches pruned too often. Instead of spreading outward, the limbs fold back on themselves. Each new branch is a repetition of the same few names, the same few genes. Eventually the tree stops growing. That was the genetic shape of Neanderthal society in its final millennia, scattered, closed, and shrinking. This does not mean the Neanderthals were doomed by inferiority, only by arithmetic. Even with strong bodies and sharp minds, biology cannot cheat statistics. A population needs a certain minimum size to remain viable across time, what biologists call the effective population size. For Neanderthals, estimates place this number astonishingly low, perhaps as few as several hundred individuals per region. In some valleys, maybe fewer. The Altai genome shows that the Neanderthal population there had been isolated from Western groups for tens of thousands of years, separated by mountains, glaciers, and distance. Their total genetic diversity was less than that of a modern endangered species like the mountain gorilla. If you had walked across Eurasia then, you might have gone weeks without seeing another human of any kind. The planet felt empty. Pockets of Neanderthals lived and died unseen by each other, their children inheriting the same limited set of genes, generation after generation. It was not malice or mistake, it was geography and climate-compressing biology into a trap. What makes this story more poignant is the contrast it sets against the early movements of Homo sapiens around the same time. Genetic evidence suggests that our species, though small in number, maintained a slightly larger effective population size. Groups of sapiens in Africa were exchanging genes over wider distances, possibly due to higher mobility or broader social networks. Some scholars argue that this difference in connectivity, not intelligence, not technology, was the decisive factor that allowed sapiens to endure where Neanderthals thinned out. Our ancestors were wanderers, Neanderthals were settlers. One strategy allowed genetic renewal, the other led to genetic echo. Still, we should be cautious about romanticizing mobility. There is no evidence that Neanderthals lacked curiosity or social bonds. They simply lived in ecosystems that punished movement. The ice sheets and tundras of Pleistocene Eurasia were treacherous and sparsely populated with prey. Travel across long distances would have been perilous, especially for families with children and elders. Isolation was not a choice, it was the climate's demand. Over time, that isolation became encoded in their DNA. Scientists studying the Altai Neanderthal genome found another remarkable detail. Not only was this individual inbred, but so were her ancestors. Patterns of genetic variation suggest repeated inbreeding over at least 10 generations. This indicates that the population had been small for centuries, perhaps millennia. When compared to genomes of Neanderthals from Europe, the data show that even distant groups shared alarmingly little genetic difference. The entire species from Spain to Siberia carried less total variation than a single modern human city. Inbreeding does not always cause immediate collapse. It can persist quietly in small populations for long stretches of time, masked by the strength of healthy individuals. but it limits potential. When environments shift, when food declines, or disease spreads, inbred populations have fewer genetic tools to adapt. That rigidity may explain why Neanderthals disappeared when climates oscillated sharply, around 45,000 years ago. They had survived countless cold phases before, but each one had trimmed their numbers and variety a little more. By the time competition with expanding sapiens began, their genetic deck was stacked against them. Some researchers have tried to quantify the biological impact. Computer models show that a population of fewer than 500 breeding individuals, if isolated for several thousand years, will lose most of its heterozygosity, the diversity of gene variants, regardless of intelligence or behaviour. Once that threshold is crossed, extinction risk accelerates. The Altai Neanderthals were likely below that line, and yet, within this grim arithmetic, there is dignity. The people of that mountain cave were not doomed caricatures but survivors. For hundreds of millennia their ancestors had endured ice ages, hunted megafauna, and raised children in some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Their downfall was not lack of skill, but the narrowing of possibility. In them we can see the biological fragility of intelligence itself, the way awareness and adaptation can still be outpaced by chance. The Neanderthal story also serves as a mirror. It reminds us that species survival depends as much on connection as on strength. Geneticists who study modern humans warn that we too carry signs of ancient bottlenecks, though far less severe. The difference is that our ancestors eventually rebuilt networks wide enough to exchange genes and ideas. The lesson from the Altai genome is that intelligence alone does not guarantee endurance. Diversity, genetic and social, is the true insurance policy of life. When researchers first mapped the Neanderthal genome in detail, they were careful to frame their conclusions humbly. DNA tells us about inheritance, not intention. We cannot know whether the individuals who lived in the Altai felt trapped, or even understood their isolation. To them, their world was normal. They would have known their neighbours, raised children, mourned losses, and carried on. But from the genetic distance of 50,000 years, we can see that their lives unfolded on the edge of biological possibility. There is a strange poetry in this. Every cell of our bodies still carries fragments of their legacy. Tiny traces of Neanderthal DNA pass through ancient interbreeding events that occurred before their extinction. Those traces, though small, remind us that the boundary between survival and disappearance is thin. The Altai genome is not a story about failure but about proximity. How close even the most resilient species can come to vanishing when the world grows too small. As we look back, it becomes clear that the Neanderthals did not fall because they were less human. They fell because they were too few. The cave in the Altai holds their echo, a reminder written in nucleotides that even strength and intelligence mean little without connection. For a long time, they were alone, and in the mathematics of life, being alone is often the beginning of the end. Imagine this. The first time two groups of humans see each other, it is not on a battlefield or at a feast, but across a river. One group has followed the herds north for weeks, their footprints pressed into the frost-hardened soil of what is now the Levant. On the far bank, unfamiliar figures move among the reeds. They are human, unmistakably, but not the same. Their voices carry across the wind in a rhythm the newcomers do not understand. The hunters freeze. Do they approach, or do they vanish back into the forest? In that single, fragile moment, the human story begins to widen. Around 55,000 years before our time, humanity reached a new kind of threshold. Populations that had once been trapped by climate, distance, and isolation began to move again. The genetic bottleneck had loosened. Rainfall patterns across Africa shifted, opening green corridors where deserts had stood for millennia. Sea levels were lower, exposing land bridges between continents. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, small groups of Homo sapiens, no more than a few dozen at a time, started walking out of Africa in search of new ground. Archaeology and genetics together trace these movements like faint fingerprints across time. In the eastern Mediterranean, in places like Mount Carmel and northern Arabia, stone tools appear that match both African and Eurasian traditions. Some were left by our species, others by late Neanderthals. It was a landscape of overlap. Territories brushed against each other, though perhaps rarely mixing. But something began to change. Genetic data from ancient remains and living populations shows that, by about 50,000 years ago, gene flow between distant groups had restarted on a scale unseen since before the Great Bottleneck. Humanity was reconnecting itself. This didn't happen as one great migration, but as countless small drifts. Groups expanded along rivers, coasts and mountain passes, following herds of gazelle, aurochs, and wild horse. The world then was colder and drier than ours, but it was also rich in life. Grasses stretched across the Fertile Crescent. Lakes dotted the Arabian Peninsula. The Sinai and Bab el-Mandeb regions acted as gateways between continents. Each route offered chance encounters, not planned, not frequent, but enough to change our DNA forever. What did these encounters feel like? We can only guess. Early Homo sapiens would have recognized their own kind instantly. Upright posture, expressive eyes, familiar hands. Yet every group carried its own accent of anatomy, subtle differences shaped by isolation. One band might have been taller, leaner, adapted to heat. Another might have had broader faces, thicker hair, or lighter skin tones. To meet someone outside your known circle would have been both wonder and risk. They could be kin of a kind, or something else entirely. For thousands of years, these meetings remained rare and fragile. A single shared campfire, a trade of food, an exchange of gestures might be all that passed between them. But even a few such moments, repeated across generations, were enough to rekindle the ancient pattern of genetic mixing. Modern genomics shows evidence of this. Populations in both Africa and Eurasia from this era carry traces of regional interbreeding. The species that had nearly gone extinct was rediscovering its network. The timing of this expansion coincides with what geneticists call an increase in effective population size. Not just more people, but more connection among them. When isolated populations meet, their combined gene pool grows exponentially. The genetic record from this period reveals a sudden broadening of diversity. It is as if the species took a deep breath after holding it for 40,000 years. That breath would carry us into every ecosystem on Earth. The corridors that made this possible were ecological gifts. Northern Africa's climate oscillated between wet and dry phases every few millennia, and when rains returned, the Sahara transformed from desert into grassland, dotted with rivers and shallow lakes. These green Sahara windows served as bridges northward. Coastal routes along the Red Sea offered another pathway. Archaeological finds from Jebel Fire and Al-Wusta in Arabia suggest human presence long before the famous Exodus around 50,000 years ago. Perhaps there were multiple waves, some that failed, others that lingered. The record shows footprints, tools, and faint traces of hearths, but never permanence. Humanity was still an experiment in motion. For the groups leaving Africa, every horizon was new. They would have followed the same instincts that guided animals: water, warmth, shelter. Yet every step outward also carried them closer to others, to Neanderthals in the Levant, to Denisovans in Asia, and to distant relatives still living within Africa itself. Gene flow was not a single encounter, but a mosaic of crossings. At each contact zone, a few individuals exchanged genes, and the effect spread slowly through generations. From a population genetics perspective, this was the first time in human history when the map began to connect. Where before there had been small, isolated dots, there were now lines linking them. Migration routes that allowed information, genes, and ideas to move. The numbers were still small, perhaps tens of thousands of Homo sapiens worldwide. But in evolutionary terms, this reconnected network marked the difference between stagnation and survival. It's tempting to imagine these meetings as dramatic, but they were likely mundane. Two hunting groups find themselves at the same water source. A wary approach, a day of distance, then a gesture, a gift of meat, or silence accepted as peace. In that moment, reproductive isolation breaks. Perhaps a child is born months later carrying a blend of both lineages. That child's descendants will carry the genetic memory of that meeting for tens of thousands of years. We now detect such moments not in artifacts but in base pairs, sequences of DNA showing that ancient populations, once separated by continents, shared ancestry. Yet not every encounter was friendly or fruitful. The world remained harsh. Many small groups vanished before leaving descendants. Others moved on, splitting, merging and adapting. Over time, the genetic gradient across Eurasia smoothed. By 45,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens were established from the Levant to the steppes of Central Asia. The population density was still thin, but the connectivity was real. From then on, no human population would ever be entirely isolated again. When we talk about gene flow, it sounds abstract, but what it really means is reunion. The human genome is a palimpsest of meetings. Each crossover event, each hybrid child, a restoration of diversity lost during the long bottleneck. Without those early encounters, the genetic uniformity of our species might have remained dangerously narrow. The reintroduction of variation gave natural selection new material to work with, strengthening immune systems, diversifying metabolisms, and buffering us against future disease. In a sense, these meetings between tribes, cautious, wordless, fragile, were the biological foundation of our resilience. It is easy to imagine the first outsiders as enemies, but they were also opportunity. In small groups, new faces meant new possibilities, new mates, new knowledge, new survival tricks. Over generations, this curiosity would become one of our defining traits, the drive to explore beyond known borders. The genetic evidence of expansion around this time marks the beginning of that curiosity made flesh. We know this not through fossils alone, but through the genome of living people. Modern human DNA carries signals of expansions that trace back to this era. Populations in Africa show a pattern of branching and rejoining, while those outside Africa descend from a subset that left during this period. That subset carries within it traces of Neanderthal genes, proof that contact occurred not long after these first migrations. But we will leave that for later in the story. For now, what matters is that movement had begun, and with it, connection. What drove that first step outward? Climate may have provided the opening, but restlessness probably did the rest. Every generation, a few individuals likely wandered farther than before, a young hunter following migrating herds, a family displaced by drought, a band chasing rumours of water over the horizon. None of them would have known they were reshaping the destiny of their species. For them, it was simply survival, a search for continuity. For us, it was the first global expansion written in our bones. From a distance of 50 millennia, the details blur, but the pattern remains clear. After tens of thousands of years of isolation, humanity began to link its fragments together again. Each crossing, each shared gene, each migration corridor was a thread in the web that would one day span the planet. When two tribes met for the first time, what they saw across that river may have been fear, curiosity, or recognition, but what followed was far more important than any first impression, a slow reconnection of a species learning how to be one again. Two camps face each other across a clearing, small fires glowing against the snowlight of an Ice Age plain. Between them stands a young woman, her hair bound with sinew, a gift of dried meat in her hands. She's leaving her family to join another band she has met only once before. The air hums with the tension of ceremony. The men exchange tokens, a shell, a flint blade, a woven cord, gestures older than language itself. No one calls it marriage. No one calls it law. But what is happening here is one of the quietest revolutions in human history, the invention of the rule of strangers. Around 40,000 years before our time, as Homo sapiens spread across Eurasia, something profound began to shift in the structure of human relationships. For hundreds of millennia, mating had followed the rhythms of proximity. Families, extended kin, and small allied groups determined who paired with whom. But as populations grew and territories overlapped, humans began to face a new biological problem, one they could now perceive consciously, even if they could not explain it. They had learned, by observation or by cost, that too much closeness led to weakness. Somewhere between instinct and understanding, they started to form rules. Rules about distance, exchange, and belonging. Exogamy, the practice of finding mates beyond one's group, is one of humanity's oldest unwritten laws. We take it for granted now, but it had to begin somewhere, at some moment when isolation turned to cooperation. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies suggest that these early systems of alliance were not just biological solutions but social technologies. To send a daughter to another camp, to welcome a visitor as kin rather than threat, was to create a thread of peace across an uncertain landscape. Every exchange reduced risk, widened trust, and rebalanced the fragile equations of survival. How do you invent a rule for who not to love? It doesn't start as a moral principle. It begins as pattern recognition. A group notices that children of close relatives are more likely to die young or to be sickly. They notice that outsiders, when welcomed, bring new songs, tools, and knowledge. Over generations, these observations crystallize into traditions, a network of do's and don'ts encoded in ritual. Among early humans, such practices might have been reinforced by gifts, objects with symbolic value passed between groups to mark the right to partnership. The exchange of mates likely coincided with the exchange of resources, creating what anthropologists call reciprocal altruism, a balance between giving and receiving that kept both biology and society in harmony. The archaeology of this period, spanning roughly 40 to 35,000 years ago, shows clear evidence of expanding networks. Shell beads from Mediterranean shores appear in Central Europe. Obsidian from the Caucasus turns up hundreds of kilometers away. These materials do not travel by accident. They move through hands, through relationships, through trust. Each object is a fossil of a handshake, proof that communication and exchange connected distant bands. And behind those exchanges, unseen in the fossil record but visible in our DNA, flowed the lifeblood of exogamy. Even before symbolic art or large settlements, there were protocols of encounter, small acts of respect that managed tension between strangers. Among modern hunter-gatherers, such systems persist. The San of southern Africa approach unknown groups with cautious gifts of food. The Hadza share tobacco or honey before entering another band's territory. The Inuit once practiced silent exchange, leaving objects in the snow for others to take in acknowledgement of peace. These rituals, humble as they seem, are the evolutionary descendants of the same behaviours that likely began 40 millennia ago. They are the behavioural scaffolding of civilization itself, not born from conquest, but from courtship. What makes these early social systems extraordinary is how consistent they are across time and geography. Wherever humans have lived in small groups, similar rules arise. One of them is the principle of delayed reciprocity. Give now, receive later. Another is hospitality, offering food or shelter to outsiders under a temporary truce. A third is exogamy itself, the rule that forbids the closest bonds from turning inward. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss once called it the first social contract, the moment when humanity replaced raw instinct with agreement. To obey the rule of strangers is to admit that survival depends on someone who is not you. In genetic terms, the impact of these alliances was enormous. By the time populations had spread across the northern latitudes, effective population sizes increased again, suggesting wider mating networks. Groups that once hovered near extinction began to diversify. Mutations were diluted, immunity strengthened, and adaptability expanded. The DNA of modern non-African humans carries signatures of this period, small but crucial signals of regional mixing, showing that isolation had given way to interconnection. Where the Altai Neanderthals had failed to escape their genetic loops, Homo sapiens succeeded by creating social ones instead. But these were not utopias. The invention of rules implies the possibility of breaking them. Jealousy, theft, or betrayal could tear fragile alliances apart. That is why rituals emerged, to make the invisible visible. A gift made trust tangible, a shared meal sealed an agreement. Even a scar, a tattoo, or a necklace might have served as a portable reminder of connection. Anthropologists studying early social exchange describe it as the birth of obligation, the realization that relationship carries a cost, but that cost ensures continuity. In the cold steppes and forests of Eurasia, these relationships were survival strategies. A small group facing a bad winter could seek help from another family because their children shared blood. In such cases, marriage was not just about reproduction. It was about logistics, the management of uncertainty. To love someone from another camp was to build a bridge against hunger. Over centuries, those bridges thickened into networks that could span entire regions. By 40,000 years ago, humans had likely developed the first recognizable kinship systems, categories of relatives by marriage, descent, and alliance. These were not written, of course, but encoded in memory and practice. Elders would remember who was linked to whom, which families owed favours, which alliances were safe. This collective memory served as a map, one drawn not on stone but in stories. It allowed small groups to navigate a world too large for their numbers. The irony is that these early rules of love and distance were probably maintained by fear as much as by affection. The fear of the unfamiliar, the fear of sickness, the fear of losing the fragile piece that kept groups alive. Yet within that fear was respect, a recognition that difference was dangerous but necessary. Every successful exchange between outsiders reinforced that lesson. We must remain apart to survive together. Modern behavioural ecology supports this interpretation. Across animal species, systems of mate exchange emerge spontaneously when population density rises. In wolves, neighbouring packs occasionally trade dispersing individuals, reducing inbreeding. In chimpanzees and bonobos, females emigrate to new communities at sexual maturity. Humans took these instincts and transformed them into culture. We turned biology into ethics, chants into ceremony. It's possible that even language itself began to evolve under the pressure of such exchanges. To negotiate trust between groups, you need clarity, persuasion, and ritual speech. The greetings and negotiations that structured early meetings may have driven linguistic complexity, giving us the tools to define, promise, and forbid. Words became invisible contracts, replacing the randomness of instinct with the architecture of rule. The emergence of exogamy also changed the way humans thought about belonging. Before, family and tribe were identical. Now, identity could stretch beyond blood, to affines, to allies, to distant kin you might never meet. It was the first expansion of the human social mind, a prelude to everything that would follow: trade, culture, politics, even empathy. Once humans learned to think of us as something that could include strangers, the species became unstoppable. Still, we should resist imagining this as a single moment of enlightenment. It was gradual, patchy, fragile. Some groups likely clung to older insular traditions, while others experimented with new forms of exchange. The success of exogamy was not guaranteed, but over time, the genetic evidence shows that it worked. Populations stabilized, diversity rose, and humanity stepped further from extinction's shadow. By 35,000 years ago, the rule of strangers had become one of our defining traits. It would shape migration patterns, social systems, and even morality for tens of millennia. To this day, every culture carries echoes of it, from taboos on close-kin marriage to the universal etiquette of welcoming guests. It is the biological memory of a time when the survival of the species depended on the kindness of outsiders. So when we ask how humans invented rules for who not to love, the answer may be simple. They learned to value the unknown. Every early alliance, every traded gift, every marriage beyond kin was a small act of courage against the pull of familiarity. In a world still shaped by scarcity and fear, that courage was the beginning of civilization. Two children lie side by side beneath the frozen soil of Ice Age Russia. They have been carefully positioned head to head, their small bodies covered in red ochre, surrounded by thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved pendants. Each bead has been shaped, polished, and threaded by hand, more than 10,000 in total. Their limbs are dusted in powder, their clothing rich with decoration, their grave a masterpiece of devotion. They are clearly cherished, but when scientists examine their DNA more than 34,000 years later, the result defies everything we might expect. The two children, buried so closely that their skulls almost touch, are not related. The burial site is known as Sunghir, located northeast of Moscow on the banks of the Klyazma River. It was first uncovered in the mid-20th century, but it took decades, and finally the tools of modern genetics, to reveal its deeper secret. The Sunghir burials belong to an advanced Upper Paleolithic culture, one of the earliest we know in Europe, dated to roughly 34,000 years before our present. What makes them extraordinary is not only the beauty of the artifacts, but the story their genomes tell about how early humans organised their societies. When researchers sequenced the DNA of the individuals from the two main graves, an adult male and the two children, they expected to find close kinship, perhaps siblings or cousins. After all, the shared grave, the symmetry of their ornaments, and the sheer investment of time and labour suggested family ties. But the genome said otherwise. The two boys were genetically no closer than second cousins. Even more surprising, the adult man in the nearby grave, once thought to be their father or elder relative, also shared no recent ancestry with them. In fact, none of the individuals in the burial cluster appeared closely related. This discovery, published in Science in 2017 by a team from Cambridge and Copenhagen, changed how we understand prehistoric social life. It revealed that by the Upper Paleolithic, humans were already structuring their communities around principles far more complex than simple family lines. Inbreeding was being deliberately avoided. These were people who understood, in practice if not in theory, that survival required partners from elsewhere. They had invented not just the rule of strangers, but the rituals that made that rule sacred. Sunghir offers a rare window into this transition, because of how well it preserves both biology and symbolism. The genetic evidence shows that each individual came from a different family line within a larger network of groups. Their ornaments, thousands of labour-intensive decorations, tell us that identity, status and alliance were no longer only personal or familial. They had become shared, codified through aesthetics. Each bead represents hours of work, each thread of decoration a statement of belonging to something larger than one's bloodline. Archaeologists who studied the site noticed patterns in the distribution of objects, sets of beads arranged symmetrically across the children's clothing, clusters of animal teeth aligned by species and size, carvings positioned in mirrored order. This symmetry may have reflected a cultural language, a grammar of ornamentation marking kinship, marriage eligibility, or membership within a broader network. The care given to these children, despite their lack of direct relation, suggests that they held symbolic importance within their community, perhaps as representatives of connected families or allied groups. For anthropologists, this pattern resonates with what we see in the later foraging societies around the world. When groups establish exogamy, the exchange of mates between clans, they often reinforce it through ritual and art. Beads, scars, body paint or tattoos serve as visual markers of identity, signalling who is eligible to marry whom. These are not decorative accidents. They are social maps worn on the body. At Sunghir, ornamentation was more than beauty. It was information. The archaeological team estimated that crafting the beads for the children's garments would have taken at least 3,000 hours of labour, equivalent to many months of collective work. This investment makes sense only in a society where symbolic communication held real value. The children may have been part of a ceremony meant to reaffirm the unity of different groups, a physical manifestation of the ties that bound their small, scattered populations into one human network. The genetic results also help us trace the limits of these networks. Even though the individuals buried at Sunghir were not close relatives, their genomes still show that the overall population was small. Genetic diversity was limited compared to modern humans, but it was maintained above the threshold of inbreeding. This delicate balance suggests that the people of Sunghir lived in small, interconnected bands, perhaps 25 to 50 individuals each, joined through alliances that extended across the plains of Ice Age Europe. Every generation, a few individuals would move between groups, carrying with them not only genes but knowledge, technologies, and traditions. The cumulative effect was stability, enough connection to sustain diversity, but enough distance to preserve identity. Sunghir is the fossilized evidence of that system working. Beyond the biological data, the archaeological context deepens the mystery. The two children were buried with an abundance of objects far beyond what would be expected for their age or status. The adult male, though richly adorned, did not receive as much attention. Some scholars have speculated that the children were part of a ritual or lineage uniting different clans, symbolic offspring of a collective rather than literal parents. Their shared grave then becomes not a family tomb, but a statement about the community's values, care for the young, reverence for cooperation, and devotion to beauty as a unifying force. Even the use of red ochre, found throughout the burial carries meaning. This iron-rich pigment, ground into powder and sprinkled over the bodies, is among humanity's oldest symbolic substances. It appears in burials and rock art across the Paleolithic world. Its presence at Sunghir may signify transformation, death as a return to the earth, but also a renewal of connection between generations and groups. The pigment binds them together visually, just as alliances bound their people genetically. When the Cambridge researchers compared the Sunghir genome to those of modern humans and other ancient populations, they noticed something striking. The pattern of genetic variation matched what one would expect in a society practicing deliberate outbreeding, systematic avoidance of close-kin pairings. In small-scale societies, this requires careful social memory and planning. People must know who their distant relatives are, even across multiple generations and groups. This means that by 34,000 years ago, humans had already developed the cognitive and social infrastructure for complex kinship systems, the ability to track relationships beyond immediate family, to define rules, and to remember obligations. It is tempting to read this as the birth of culture, but that would be too simple. What the evidence shows is not a sudden awakening, but a long, quiet mastery of balance between closeness and distance, tradition and change. The people of Sunghir were not inventing society, they were refining it. Their graves are the material proof that humanity's survival depended on coordination as much as courage. There is a certain humility in these discoveries. We often imagine prehistory as a time of brutality and ignorance, yet the data from Sunghir tell a different story. Empathy, cooperation, and symbolic intelligence existed long before cities or writing. These people faced the same genetic dangers as their ancestors, but instead of succumbing to isolation, they engineered belonging. Their social technology, the rule of exogamy, was as crucial to our evolution as fire or language. The fact that the two children were not related does not diminish the love that shaped their burial. It expands it. Their community invested thousands of hours in their farewell because those children represented more than themselves. They were the visible threads of an invisible web that kept their species alive. When you look at the reconstructed faces of the Sunghir children today, soft-featured, eyes closed forever under the weight of beads and ochre, you can almost sense the enormity of what they carried. The knowledge that family could mean more than blood, that love could be extended through ritual and rule, that strangers could be folded into kin. The beads of Sunghir, each drilled and polished by hand, are more than decoration. They are the first written record of the human social genome, the language of alliance, diversity and survival, expressed not in words, but in labour and care. 34,000 years later, we still wear its descendants on our skin. Wedding rings, uniforms, heirlooms, badges, and art. All echoes of the same instinct to bind ourselves to others through meaning. Imagine this. A group of hunters moves silently across a frozen plain, their breath white in the morning air. Behind them, the sun lifts over a horizon of snow and mammoth tracks. They are not wandering aimlessly. They are following memory. Hundreds of kilometers away, another group is moving too, tracing a mirrored path toward the same valley. When the snow melts and the rivers break open, they will meet there, not as strangers, not as kin, but as partners in a network that has no map and no borders. Between 34,000 and 28,000 years before our time, the planet was locked in the depths of the last ice age. Across Eurasia, glaciers advanced from the north, pressing human life into narrow corridors of land where food, water, and warmth still existed. And yet, even in this world of scarcity, humans found ways to stay connected. Archaeology shows that far from being isolated pockets of survivors, the small bands of Homo sapiens who lived during this period were linked through vast invisible webs of movement and exchange. At first glance, it seems impossible. The distances were immense, the temperatures brutal, and the population thin. Estimates suggest that all of Europe may have held fewer than 50,000 people, scattered in groups rarely exceeding 50 individuals each. But these bands were not static. They moved seasonally, following herds of reindeer, mammoth, and horse across the steppes. These migrations created rhythmic patterns of gathering and dispersal, the first pulse of long-distance social life. Archaeological evidence from sites such as 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 Dolny and Pavlov shows repeated occupations over generations, suggesting that groups returned to the same locations at regular intervals. These were not permanent settlements but seasonal aggregation sites, places where rivers, cliffs, or abundant prey drew communities together for a few precious weeks each year. Here they hunted cooperatively, exchanged mates, traded materials, and renewed social bonds. The landscape itself became a calendar of reunion. Imagine one of these gatherings. The snow is melting, and a wide river valley bursts with migrating herds. Dozens of small family camps arrive from every direction, their paths marked by the same ancient routes carved into memory. Fires rise in the night, songs are shared, tools repaired, alliances renewed. Children play among the tents, learning faces they will remember when they are old enough to choose partners. These meetings were not festivals as we would imagine them. They were lifelines. Every year the network stitched itself together again before scattering back into the wilderness. How far could these networks stretch? The evidence suggests astonishing range. Archaeologists have found marine shells from the Black Sea as far inland as Central Europe, and volcanic obsidian from the Caucasus hundreds of kilometres north. These materials travelled not through trade as we understand it, but through chains of kin and friendship, each hand passing an object along to the next group encountered. A shell worn as a pendant in one region might have been a gift from a person several journeys away. Each artifact was a message that the world was bigger than a single horizon. The mobility of these Ice Age groups can be compared, cautiously, to that of modern hunter-gatherers such as Aboriginal Australians or the Native American tribes of the Great Plains. Both relied on seasonal movement, complex territorial knowledge, and intergroup cooperation to survive in harsh environments. Among the Aboriginal groups, for instance, vast networks of exchange known as dreaming tracks connected distant communities through shared rituals and songlines, pathways of both geography and ancestry. Similarly, the Plains tribes maintained expansive kinship networks, with intermarriage and ritualized gatherings ensuring that no group remained genetically or socially isolated. The Ice Age networks of Eurasia likely functioned in the same way, flexible, memory-based systems that kept humanity from fracturing. Genetic studies of Upper Paleolithic populations support this picture. Even though individual groups were small, there was consistent gene flow across the continent. Populations separated by thousands of kilometres show subtle but measurable relatedness, indicating that people were moving, slowly, generation by generation, and meeting others along the way. This mobility preserved diversity and resilience in an otherwise unforgiving world. Where Neanderthals had once been trapped in isolated valleys, Homo sapiens turned the landscape itself into a bridge. Archaeology offers glimpses of how these networks were maintained. Shared tool traditions, such as finely crafted blades and bone points, appear across vast areas, showing that information travelled as easily as people did. The techniques of flint knapping or ivory carving were transmitted like oral language, each generation teaching the next. Decorative styles, too, cross boundaries. The same patterns of engraving and beadwork appear from the Don River to the Danube, as if fashion trends were already circulating tens of millennia before cities or writing. Even the rhythms of life were synchronized across regions. Hearth remains from sites thousands of kilometers apart show similar patterns of use, seasonal layers of ash alternating with long periods of absence. It is as if the continent itself breathed in and out, expanding and contracting with the seasons. When the world froze, people retreated into sheltered valleys. When it thawed, they emerged to reconnect. In this way, humanity survived not as isolated sparks, but as a constellation of fires spread across a frozen world. To travel those distances required extraordinary spatial intelligence. Long before maps or compasses, humans navigated through landmarks, memory and story. Each valley, each cliff, each bend in a river became part of a mental atlas passed down through generations. In this sense, geography was not just terrain but heritage. Knowledge of where to find flint, where herds crossed rivers, where another group might camp. This was the true currency of survival. It's worth remembering that these movements were not aimless wanderings. They followed cycles, and those cycles built familiarity. A group returning to an aggregation site might find the traces of last year's fire still visible beneath the soil. They might find a carved object left intentionally, a signal of continuity, a promise that others would come again. In this way, humans learned to inhabit time as well as space. The land became a conversation sustained across generations. At the heart of these gatherings lay exchange, not of goods alone, but of knowledge, stories, and genes. Anthropologists studying modern foragers describe how intergroup meetings serve multiple purposes at once. They distribute food surpluses, reinforce social norms, arrange marriages, and maintain peace. For Ice Age humans, every meeting carried these same layers of meaning. A new tool-making technique shared between bands might save lives in the next winter. A marriage across groups could ensure fresh genetic strength for decades to come. The archaeological record shows that even in the depths of the Ice Age, these networks had structure. Regional clusters of sites share overlapping material cultures, suggesting that neighbouring groups maintained regular contact, while long-distance connections stretched thinner but still persisted. It was a web of webs, dense locally, looser across continents, yet resilient enough to span from the Pyrenees to Siberia. This interconnectedness also explains the rapid spread of ideas and technologies in the Upper Paleolithic. Innovations such as tailored clothing, bone needles, and composite tools appear across vast distances in surprisingly short times. These were not isolated inventions but shared achievements, diffused through the network of travellers and marriages. Human progress in this era was collective, not because of central authority but because of social fluidity. Mobility came with risk, of course. The same networks that spread innovation also spread disease, conflict, and competition. But they also carried compassion. Archaeologists have found healed injuries on skeletons, evidence that people were cared for long after they could no longer hunt. Such altruism makes sense only in a society where help can be repaid across distance and time, where care given in one camp might return from another. This interdependence, fragile but persistent, may have been the greatest adaptation of all. In a sense, the Ice Age networks were the first human internet, a slow biological web that connected distant minds through the movement of bodies, stories, and symbols. It was inefficient, prone to collapse, but remarkably durable. Each generation renewed it without blueprint or government, sustained only by memory, ritual, and the simple need not to be alone. What remains of that web today lies buried in both soil and genome. Every living human carries traces of these ancient movements, genetic signatures of ancestors who walked between groups, who traded, who loved across boundaries of language and landscape. Their footsteps, faint as they are, mark the beginning of globalization in its most elemental form, the sharing of survival. If the Ice Age taught our species anything, it was that isolation is a luxury we cannot afford. In the face of cold, scarcity, and extinction, connection became the only reliable shelter. The networks of the Ice Age were not made of wire or code, but of people who remembered where others would be, who trusted that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone else was walking toward the same fire. Imagine this. A traveller walks into a camp she has never seen before. The air is cold, the language strange, but around the stranger's necks hang beads carved in the same pattern she wears, the same shape her mother taught her to carve, the same ochre stain her people grind from stone. No one needs to speak. The symbols do the talking. They mean, you are one of us, though not from here. You are safe. You may stay the night. You may share the fire. Around 30,000 to 25,000 years before our time, humanity learned something astonishing. That identity could be carried not only in blood, but in objects. Across the frozen continents of the late Ice Age, small bands of Homo sapiens were scattered, mobile, and constantly facing the threat of isolation. But isolation was dangerous. Without new connections, without fresh partners, a lineage could fade within generations. And so, long before the first words for marriage or tribe existed, we invented a system of signs, ornaments, pigments, patterns, that allowed us to recognize who was kin, who was potential kin, and who was not. Anthropologists sometimes call these symbolic technologies, but perhaps they were more like early genetic tools, not manipulating DNA, but managing it socially. The exchange of ornament and colour was a way of navigating reproductive safety without written rules. To modernize, these artefacts are beautiful. To Ice Age humans, they were practical. They encoded the knowledge of belonging. By 30,000 years ago, beads, pendants, and ochre markings were everywhere. Ivory and shell ornaments appear from the Pyrenees to Siberia, carved in shapes so consistent that they seem to belong to a shared visual language. Some motifs, spiral engravings, punctured discs, zigzags, repeat across thousands of kilometres as if entire regions were participating in the same aesthetic conversation. Archaeologists call this the symbolic explosion of the Upper Paleolithic, but it might just as easily be seen as the rise of social encryption. These designs allowed people who had never met to identify one another as part of a larger network, distant allies bound by custom and memory. Ochre, too, became part of this communication system. For hundreds of thousands of years before this, red ochre had been used sporadically, perhaps for body decoration or pigment. But around this time, its use multiplied and diversified. People ground it into powders, smeared it on the skin, mixed it with animal fat, and used it to paint objects and tools. Chemical analyses show that the same geological sources of ochre were sometimes transported over immense distances, carried as valued trade items. It was more than colour, it was code. When a visitor arrived wearing a familiar shade or pattern of ochre, it told others that she came from a group within the same alliance system, that her people followed similar customs, similar rules about kinship and exchange. This was critical. In a world where accidental inbreeding could cripple a population, cultural identity became a safety mechanism. The pigments and pendants were not decoration. They were a biological strategy disguised as beauty. The parallels with modern hunter-gatherers are striking. Among Aboriginal Australian groups, for example, intricate kinship systems define exactly who can marry whom, often encoded in totems, body paint and songlines. Among many First Nations peoples of North America, clan symbols marked not only social identity, but marital boundaries. To belong to the same symbol group was to share ancestry, and therefore to be forbidden from union. We can imagine that Ice Age societies operated with a similar logic. Symbols were not mere art, they were tools for remembering who not to love. These codes were flexible enough to adapt to geography. In Western Europe, for instance, shell beads from Mediterranean coasts have been found far inland, suggesting that objects could travel even where people rarely did. This created what archaeologists call symbolic frontiers, zones where patterns overlapped and intermingled, much like dialects. A bead design might shift slightly from one region to another, forming gradients of identity that helped people navigate the vast network of human groups. Even more fascinating is how ornamentation intersects with the evolution of cognition itself. Cognitive archaeologists argue that the consistent use of symbolic artifacts represents a new level of abstract thinking, the ability to link an object with an idea and to maintain that association across time and space. This was not just personal expression, it was collective memory externalized. Each bead was a unit of meaning, a node in the social web. To create it was to participate in a shared system of thought. Imagine the quiet focus of an Ice Age artisan carving a bead from mammoth ivory, repeating the same motion hundreds of times to create identical forms. Every groove and perforation would have been intentional, guided by tradition. When she strung the beads together, she was not merely making jewellery. She was assembling a message that could cross generations. Her children would inherit it, wear it, recognise it on others, and know instantly where they stood in the map of human connection. Ritual likely grew from these same patterns of exchange. Whenever distant groups met, to trade, to intermarry, to share stories, they needed more than language. They needed ceremony to make the meeting safe. Around this time, evidence of organised gatherings becomes clearer in the archaeological record. Hearths surrounded by large quantities of ochre, animal bones arranged in deliberate patterns, and concentrations of beadwork suggest that people were marking these encounters with ritual acts. These ceremonies were not about worship in the way we might think. They were about establishing trust between strangers. In behavioural anthropology, this is called costly signalling. Actions or displays that demonstrate commitment to a shared rule or alliance. To grind ochre for hours, to craft elaborate ornaments, to sing or dance through the night. These were investments in social reliability. If you shared in the ritual, you could be trusted. Some researchers have proposed that the earliest proto-marriages may have emerged from these exchanges. Marriage, after all, is less about romance and more about alliance, a predictable way to connect groups without chaos. The use of ornament, pigment, and performance could have formalized such unions, turning what might otherwise have been random encounters into socially recognized relationships. In this sense, ritual was an early form of population management, a cultural technology for organizing reproduction across distance. It's tempting to think of these people as primitive, but in some ways, their solutions were more sophisticated than ours. They maintained genetic diversity across thousands of kilometers without written laws, governments, or borders, only memory and meaning. The rules were carried in minds, songs, and colors. A single mistake, a union with too close a relative, could have consequences generations long. So the stakes of remembering were enormous, and still, mystery remains. Why were certain symbols chosen? Why did the same patterns recur from France to Siberia? Perhaps these were not arbitrary decorations, but echoes of shared myth, abstract representations of stories passed orally along the network. If so, then the human imagination was already functioning as a global system long before cities or nations existed. Archaeological finds from sites like Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, reveal remarkable levels of artistry and cultural consistency. Here, fired clay figurines, engraved ivory, and elaborate beadwork show that ornamentation was embedded in daily life. These people lived amid ice and scarcity, yet they devoted time to shaping symbols, an act that only makes sense if the symbols mattered to survival itself. So when we speak of the first rituals, we are really describing the birth of a new kind of intelligence, social intelligence, the ability to navigate relationships not just through emotion or instinct, but through shared abstraction. The ochre on the skin, the bead on the necklace, the gesture repeated year after year, these were memory systems, codes that kept humanity genetically healthy and socially stable. Over time, the meaning of these rituals would deepen. What began as pragmatic markers of belonging would evolve into sacred traditions, myth, and art. But at their root lay a biological truth. Cooperation and diversity were essential to survival. Ceremony was not separate from evolution, it was part of it. As the Ice Age continued and the climate grew harsher, these symbolic networks held humanity together. When people moved on, they carried their rituals with them. The beads, the pigments, the gestures, fragments of a shared language older than any word. And perhaps in a quiet way we still carry them now. The rings we exchange, the dances we perform at weddings, the colours we wear to signal status or grief, all may trace back to those first experiments in trust, carved in ivory and worn against the skin. So maybe the first genetic technology wasn't written in the nucleus of a cell, but in the stories and symbols that told us who we could safely love. And when we look at the ochre-stained beads in a museum display case today, we aren't just looking at art. We're looking at a code that kept our species alive, a message across 30,000 years whispering, "Remember me, remember us, remember the rules that let us keep moving forward." Imagine a world where the distance between families could kill a species, where the mountains and the ice didn't just separate people, they thinned the gene pool, one birth at a time. It is somewhere around 20,000 years before our time, and humanity is scattered into the last refugees of the Ice Age. Small bands, maybe a few dozen souls each, cling to survival in cold valleys, steppe plateaus, and narrow river corridors. They know the same faces year after year. They marry within the same few families, and the cost of that isolation begins to show, not in sudden collapse but in quiet weakening, subtle deformities, stillbirths, the slow mathematics of genetic decay. This is when the story of gods may have begun, not as deities in the sky, but as gatherings on the ground. For in those final millennia of the Ice Age, humans started building places designed not for shelter, but for meeting. Circles of stone, open-air enclosures, carved pillars rising from the soil like frozen ancestors. We know them today by names like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Halan Chemi, though these names are much younger than the sites themselves. What matters is not the architecture, but what it did to human biology. it allowed people to come together again. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt once described 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 as a meeting place before agriculture, and the idea still reshapes how we see the late Stone Age. Long before anyone planted grain or tamed an animal, humans had learned that connection needed architecture. When small bands lived apart for too long, their children paid the price. So these places, circles of limestone pillars, carved with foxes, snakes and vultures, may have begun not as temples, but as genetic reset points. Places where distant groups met under symbolic neutrality, traded, feasted, and shared more than food. Genetic models support the backdrop of this shift. Around 18,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum began to loosen its grip. Populations that had been trapped for millennia in refugia, isolated pockets of land along coasts and river valleys, began to move again. DNA recovered from Upper Paleolithic remains in Anatolia, the Levant, and southeastern Europe shows a slow remixing of lineages that had diverged during the coldest centuries. Humanity was reconnecting its map. But connection required trust, and trust required ritual. We often think of religion as born from fear or wonder, but perhaps it was also born from biology, the need to cooperate across distance. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒, which would not rise until the very end of this period, around 12,000 years ago, we see the culmination of something older, an inherited instinct to gather, feast and exchange partners safely under shared symbols. The stone circles there are not homes. There are no hearths, no waste from daily life. The evidence shows food in abundance, wild game prepared in large quantities, and chemical traces of fermented beverages, early beer. These were seasonal events, not permanent settlements. The logic fits the evolutionary pattern. When human groups reached a certain level of isolation, the danger of inbreeding rose sharply. The solution was to organize periodic aggregations, temporary population hubs where strangers could mingle, exchange genes, and disperse again. Such gatherings are still seen in modern hunter-gatherer societies. Among the San peoples of southern Africa, seasonal rain dances bring together groups who may have been apart for months. In the Arctic, Inuit communities once travelled vast distances to meet at midwinter, sharing food and arranging marriages. These are not acts of religion in the modern sense. They are acts of survival wrapped in culture. Now imagine the same pattern 30,000 years earlier, during the deep cold of the Upper Paleolithic. Each year or each season, small bands would converge on a known place, perhaps marked by a distinct outcrop, a spring or a stand of ancient trees. There, alliances were renewed through ritual exchange. Songs, ornaments, pigments, and yes, partners. The gathering was sacred because it kept the lineage alive. The leap from social ritual to spiritual meaning is small. Once a place becomes vital for life, where ancestors met, where new unions began, where the species itself was preserved, it begins to carry weight in the imagination. Returning there each generation, people would have layered new symbols, new carvings, new myths. Over time, the memory of "we met here to survive" would become "the ancestors are here, then the spirits live here, and finally, the gods dwell here." The birth of divinity could have been nothing more than the slow fossilization of practical cooperation into story. Archaeology supports hints of this transformation. Sites from the Epipaleolithic Levant, such as Rakafet Cave and Hilazon Taktit, show elaborate communal feasts before agriculture, complete with mass consumption of animal bones and early traces of fermented drink. These events likely marked social alliances. Around 15,000 years ago, ritual architecture appears in the form of carved pits and aligned stones, predating 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 by millennia. The architecture of connection was already evolving, so why call this segment the Inbred Gods? Because perhaps the first deities were not supernatural at all. They were the social forces that rose to prevent inbreeding from destroying us. To early humans, these gatherings must have felt miraculous, a time of plenty, of strangers welcomed, of new faces and new energy. When the band returned to its home valley afterward, children would be born with healthier traits, mortality would fall, survival would rise. What better explanation, in a world without genetics, than that the meeting place itself was blessed? Here, the biological and the spiritual intertwine. Our capacity for abstract belief, for projecting intention into the world, may have evolved precisely because it strengthened cooperation. To share a myth about a sacred place was to ensure everyone returned there. Belief became the glue that bound the network. Those who believed most strongly gathered most reliably, exchanged most widely, and therefore maintained genetic health. In evolutionary terms, faith might have been adaptive. The stones of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒, carved some 8,000 years later than the coldest phase of the Ice Age, still echo that purpose. Their animal reliefs and symmetrical circles may have encoded the same message our Ice Age ancestors carried in ochre and beads. Here is where strangers meet as kin. Archaeologists have found no evidence of domestic life at 𝐓𝐶𝐓𝐿𝐄𝐒, no traces of ordinary settlement. It was a ritual hub, a pilgrimage point. The people who built it came from many regions, bringing different flint types, animal remains, and artistic styles. In biological terms, it was a panmictic node, a mixing ground. From there, it is a short leap to organised cosmology. Once gatherings became regular, the myths attached to them could stabilise, elaborating into stories of creation, death, and renewal. The cycles of migration mirrored the cycles of the seasons. The periodic reunion of tribes may have inspired early ideas of resurrection, the world dying each winter, reborn each spring. What began as a genetic safeguard slowly became theology. Modern genomic data gives us a mirror to look backward. The low genetic diversity of our species compared to other primates tells us that we passed through severe bottlenecks, possibly reducing global numbers to a few thousand individuals at times. That we survived at all suggests that cooperation, and the systems that enabled it, were selected for. Our ancestors who believed in shared rituals and alliances would have had better odds of reproduction than those who did not. If so, the capacity for symbolic ritual was not an accident of culture. It was a biological trait refined by selection. This perspective also reframes what worship meant in those early contexts. To sacrifice food or time to a communal gathering was to invest in the genetic resilience of the group. What we now call a temple feast may once have been a social algorithm ensuring gene flow. The prayers, songs, and symbols would come later, built upon this foundation of mutual dependence. It is humbling to think that what we call religion, with its cathedrals, pilgrimages, and cosmic narratives, may trace its lineage to the quiet, pragmatic problem of too much sameness. That the first gods were not sky beings, but social agreements. That holiness began as healthiness, and yet there's beauty in that idea. It means our need to belong, to gather, to tell stories together, is older than belief itself. It means that under the skin of every religion lies something far simpler and more human, the instinct to survive together rather than apart. So when archaeologists sift the soil at 𝐓𝐶𝐓𝐿𝐄𝐒 and find the remnants of barley beer, feasting fires, and carved foxes, they are not just unearthing early religion. They are uncovering the biological roots of community. They are reading the fossil record of cooperation. In the end, the first gods may not have watched us from the heavens at all. They may have been carved into limestone to remind us to come back, to find one another again before the ice returned. Imagine the smell first. Smoke, roasted meat, damp grain sweetening in the air. The wind carries laughter across a limestone ridge in the dawn of the Holocene, around 12,000 years before our time. In a world still recovering from the Ice Age, people are gathering from far and wide. They walk for days across the plains of southern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, following trails carved by generations before them. They come not to trade or conquer, but to eat together. This is not an everyday meal. This is a feast against extinction. For tens of thousands of years, small bands of humans survived mostly in isolation, bound by the limits of landscape and language. But by this time, as the climate stabilized and food became more predictable, the old biological danger, inbreeding, was giving way to a new cultural solution: reunion. Archaeologists can trace it through the bones and the soil. At sites like 𝐓𝐶𝐓𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒, and 𝐬𝐓𝐾𝐒𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, layers of burned bone, cracked tools, and stone vats filled with residue, tell the story of gatherings so large that they must have required months of preparation. People didn't just hunt to survive, they hunted to meet. The animal remains found at these sites reveal scale beyond anything expected of daily life. Tens of thousands of gazelle bones at one layer, aurochs ribs, wild boar skulls, and bird wings, all consumed in single bursts of activity. These were not the leftovers of small families. They were the debris of festivals. And in a world where food meant survival, to share it freely was the ultimate gesture of trust. It said, "We are not strangers." But these feasts were not only social, they were genetic. When groups met to eat and celebrate, they were also ensuring the exchange of mates between distant lineages. The ritual of sharing food was the prelude to sharing life. Anthropologists call this exogamy, marrying or partnering outside one's immediate group, and it is one of the oldest unspoken laws of our species. These early gatherings turned that biological instinct into culture. The evidence for coordinated feasting comes from every layer of the late Epipaleolithic Near East. At Hilazon Takhdit in northern Israel, archaeologists found the burial of a woman surrounded by animal bones, turtles, cattle, gazelles, and traces of a massive communal meal. At 𝐓𝐷𝐏𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐒, chemical residues of fermented grain show that people brewed drinks, possibly proto-beer, long before agriculture. And at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒 itself, the density of burned bones and flint tools around the stone enclosures suggests that hundreds, perhaps thousands, came together there in waves. These sites were not villages. They were event spaces, built to handle the logistics of celebration on a scale no small band could manage alone. Imagine the work that went into such an event. Hunters spreading out across the plains for days to chase gazelle herds into natural traps. Others cutting and curing meat, gathering wild cereals and grinding them into mash. Artists carving new ornaments to wear during the gathering, symbols of identity and alliance. When the time came, fires would burn through the night as people arrived from every direction. Drums, flutes, chants, not entertainment, but synchronization. Hundreds of hearts finding the same rhythm. There is a strange paradox here. These feasts were born of scarcity, yet they embodied abundance. To consume so much at once, knowing that the world beyond the firelight was still dangerous and uncertain, required collective faith. And that faith, at its core, was biological. A belief that the group as a whole must thrive even if resources were sacrificed. Each feast was a recalibration of the human network, reweaving the web of kinship across distance. Modern ethnography helps us read these traces. Among the Hadza of Tanzania and the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 of the Kalahari, feasting rituals still serve as social glue. Groups gather periodically to share meat and stories, resolving disputes, arranging marriages, and renewing alliances. Anthropologists studying such societies note that sharing food is often a precondition for sharing genes, a deep evolutionary signal of cooperation. When we look at the charred bones and stone troughs of 12,000 years ago, we're seeing the same behaviour fossilised in time. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿, a site even older than 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐏𝐻𝐒, archaeologists found massive stone fire pits surrounded by cracked boar tusks and flint fragments. The remains of hundreds of animals were butchered, cooked and consumed, yet there is no evidence of permanent dwellings. The pattern suggests repeated, organised gatherings. Some researchers propose that these events were timed with animal migrations or seasonal cycles, transforming ecology into calendar. The world itself set the schedule for human connection. And then there was the drink. Long before brewing became industry, fermentation was chemistry discovered by accident. Wet grain left too long in a pit, its sugars converted by airborne yeast into alcohol. What began as rot became ritual. The residues found at 𝐓𝐷𝐾𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐌𝐿𝐏𝐻𝐒 contain oxalate crystals, the telltale beer stone that forms when grain ferments. To early humans, the effects must have seemed supernatural. Warmth, laughter, the easing of social tension. In small doses, alcohol increases bonding and reduces aggression. Perfect conditions for large, diverse groups to cooperate. What we now call intoxication may have been an early evolutionary advantage, turning wary strangers into allies. To modern scientists, these discoveries illuminate the roots of civilization. Before cities and laws, humanity's great innovation was the feast, a temporary society built on cooperation, generosity, and shared emotion. Feasts did not just celebrate survival, they created it. By pooling resources, people reduced risk, strengthened alliances, and allowed genetic diversity to flourish. Every shared meal was an investment in the future of the species. It's possible that language itself evolved further under these conditions. When people from different bands met at these gatherings, they needed ways to communicate beyond their immediate dialects. Gestures, symbols, and shared rituals became bridges across linguistic divides. The songs and stories that accompanied the feasts may have standardized myths, origin tales, and moral codes that helped groups remember how to coexist. In that sense, storytelling was not just entertainment. It was a social technology that made large-scale cooperation possible. The emotional side of these gatherings is harder to reconstruct, but perhaps easier to imagine. Think of the moment when the fires die down and the sound of laughter fades into tired silence. Someone begins to sing, a melody learned from a neighbouring valley, half familiar, half new. The song carries across the camp, merging accents and rhythms into something shared. For a few hours, the world feels united. That feeling, rare and fleeting, might have been the seed of what we now call spirituality, not devotion to gods, but to each other. There is another, quieter layer of meaning in these sites. Archaeologists have found that the refuse of feasting, broken bones, discarded tools, shattered vessels, was often left in place, buried beneath new floors, each new layer of stone and debris built upon the last, as if memory itself were being stacked into the earth. To return and feast again was to honour those who came before, to literally stand on the remains of past gatherings. In time, the places themselves became sacred because they held the memory of survival. The importance of these events cannot be overstated. Without periodic reunions, small human populations risked losing not just genetic diversity but cultural continuity. Language, technology, and art all depend on interaction. Isolation breeds extinction. Connection breeds innovation. The feast was the interface between biology and culture, where the flow of genes mirrored the flow of ideas. As the Holocene unfolded and climates warmed further, these rituals of connection laid the groundwork for the next great transformation, the shift to farming and settlement. But that future was still centuries away. For now, humanity's strength lay in movement and reunion, in the ability to disperse and converge like migrating herds. The feast was the pulse of that system, the heartbeat of prehistory. When we look back at those fires on the Anatolian hills, we are not seeing primitive superstition. We are seeing strategy. The first collaborative survival plan executed through culture instead of instinct. The shared meal, the fermented drink, the songs in many tongues, all of it was data transmission across time. Each generation learned that to live apart was dangerous, and that to gather was to renew life itself. So the next time we picture a festival, the laughter, the dancing, the food, we might recognise the deep ancestry beneath it. The human need to celebrate together is not just emotional, it is evolutionary. Every feast we hold today, from family dinners to national holidays, echoes that same ancient logic, to remember that survival is not a solitary act. And somewhere, under the hills of southeastern Turkey, the stones of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 still keep the rhythm. The echoes of those first festivals have not gone silent. They continue in every moment when humans choose to gather, to share, to renew the bond that once kept extinction at bay. Imagine this. The feast is over, the fires have gone cold, and the ground beneath the ashes has been packed down by thousands of feet. Smoke still clings to the stones, but no one has left. For the first time, the people stay. The same hilltop that was once a gathering place becomes something else, a space they cannot walk away from. It is around 9,500 years before our time, and humanity is beginning to do something astonishing, to settle where it once celebrated. At first, the shift is almost invisible. A few temporary shelters become semi-permanent. Tools are left behind intentionally instead of being carried home. Then someone rebuilds a stone circle, not just for the next season's feast, but for all the seasons to come. Within a few generations, the cycle of gathering and leaving begins to harden into a pattern of belonging. The place that once existed only for reunion becomes a destination, and slowly, imperceptibly, the mating ground becomes sacred ground. Archaeologists can see this transformation in the soil. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, the earliest layers are built for gatherings. Open-air enclosures surrounded by pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols. But later layers, added over centuries, show deliberate backfilling, rebuilding, and rearrangement. The circles become smaller, more enclosed, more controlled. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 and Muribet across the Euphrates Valley, we find similar enclosures, some even featuring stone benches and central posts. People were no longer just coming here to meet others. They were constructing durable architecture meant to last beyond any single generation. This change tells us something profound. Architecture, long before it housed anyone, was about memory. To carve a stone that endures after you leave is to admit that you will return. To stack walls around a circle of meeting means that the circle itself has become more than a meeting. It has become a covenant. And once that happens, the physical place begins to anchor the social one. What was once fluid, the exchange of people, food, and genes, begins to crystallize. The feast, once a moving event carried in the bodies and songs of travellers, now leaves a skeleton behind. Stone becomes the fossil of relationship. Each pillar at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 was not a monument to a deity, but a memory frozen in rock, an agreement between groups made visible. The carvings of foxes, vultures, and snakes may not have been symbols of worship, but of contracts, marks of clans and regions that met there in peace. The slow permanence of architecture also changes how humans see time. For mobile hunter-gatherers, time is cyclical, the rhythm of seasons, migrations, and returns. But once you start building for the future, time begins to stretch forward. The act of construction demands planning, prediction, and collaboration across years. Archaeologists studying 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼𝐌 have found multiple building phases stacked atop one another, each layer respecting the geometry of the previous one. It's as if the builders knew their descendants would add to it, as if continuity had become sacred. At the same time, the relationship between the people and the landscape begins to shift. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans adapted to the environment. Now, for the first time, they start to shape it. Clearing stones, levelling ground, arranging monumental enclosures, these are acts of design. Even before agriculture takes root, the idea of control, of human will inscribed into the earth, begins here. And with it comes a new psychology, the feeling that certain places are charged with power. To build is to separate. Once you raise walls around a circle, you are deciding who is inside and who is not. The first stones of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼𝐌 may have created boundaries of ritual rather than territory, but boundaries nonetheless. For the first time, participation in the social network of humanity is mediated by architecture. You can't just show up anymore, you have to belong to the system that built the stones. Archaeologist Ian Hodder once called this the beginning of entanglement, when humans and their creations become inseparable. A structure built for ritual eventually demands maintenance, renewal, protection. It shapes behaviour simply by existing. If the first gatherings were spontaneous solutions to biological problems, these new structures turn that instinct into obligation. The feast becomes a duty. The gathering becomes a pilgrimage. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼𝐌, one enclosure features a remarkable find. A large central post surrounded by benches cut into the floor. This is not domestic space. It's performative. People sat here, faced inward, and watched something happen at the centre. It could have been storytelling, dance, ritual, or dispute resolution. The point is that it was communal and structured. The architecture created hierarchy of view, if not of power. To sit inside was to participate. To watch was to be part of the whole. And yet these places still carry traces of egalitarianism. There is no evidence of elite burials, no palaces, no private chambers. The sacred was still shared. What's fascinating is that this shared sacredness may have been precisely what made cooperation possible on such a scale. To coordinate hundreds of people to quarry, transport and erect multi-ton stones required a unifying belief system, not one enforced by rulers, but by shared memory. The stones themselves were the memory. Every cut in the limestone, every carved relief, every buried pillar was part of a language, a way to encode social obligation without writing. Archaeologists sometimes describe architecture as a technology of belonging. Once built, it tells people where to return, what to repair, and who they are in relation to others. A circle of stone means something even to those who did not lay it. It's a statement that says, "We were here. You belong because you remember." It's worth noting how fast this shift happens once it begins. Within a few centuries, sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼𝐌, Neanderthal Lesson, and 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 appear across the northern Fertile Crescent, each unique, yet sharing similar principles of construction and symbolism. These are not isolated inventions. They are signs of an emerging shared worldview, one in which the social, the biological, and the spiritual merge into architecture. The places of meeting become the places of meaning. This transformation may also hint at the origins of territorial identity. When people invest labour in a site, they develop a sense of ownership. To have built something is to have a stake in it. Even if no one ruled 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒, the groups that maintained it must have felt connected to it, perhaps even responsible for guarding it. In this way, permanent ritual sites created not just cultural bonds but proto-political ones, the beginnings of regions defined by shared participation rather than by force. And then, quite suddenly, it stops. Around 8,000 years before our time, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐾𝐒 is deliberately buried. The pillars are entombed under tons of backfill carefully and intentionally. It is as if the people who built it decided to close the book. Why? No one knows. Perhaps as farming and permanent villages took over, the function of seasonal ritual centres became obsolete. When everyone lives together year-round, you no longer need to travel to a sacred hill to renew the species. The social contract had moved into daily life. What's striking, though, is how this burial was not destruction but preservation. The care with which the stones were buried suggests reverence, not rejection. The people of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐾𝐒 sealed their meeting place as if they knew it had completed its purpose. It had carried humanity from the age of scattered bands into the age of permanence. The hill that had once brought people together was now swallowed by the earth, a symbolic return perhaps to the womb of time. When archaeologists uncovered the site in the 20th century, they were astonished by its age and sophistication. But what we're really looking at is not a sudden miracle of invention, but the endpoint of a long evolutionary arc. From the first ochre-painted gatherings to the monumental stone circles, humanity had slowly externalized its social memory. The instinct to gather, once carried in stories and genes, was now carved into stone. The earth itself remembered for us. In the end, the transformation from mating grounds to sacred ground was not a single leap, but a quiet drift. Generation after generation, our ancestors turned practical acts into meaning. The same hands that once built hearths for warmth began to build enclosures for ideas. And though their faces are lost to us, their intentions are written in limestone and dust, to preserve connection through time, to remind those who came after that humanity's survival was never just about bloodlines or food, but about belonging. When you stand today among the half-buried stones of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐾𝐒 or the broken walls of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐼𝐌, what you feel is not ancient religion. It is the echo of coordination, the memory of a species that learned how to turn cooperation into architecture. The first temples were not built to reach gods, they were built to remember each other. You climb a ladder through the roof of your home, stepping out into a sunrise that glows against hundreds of rooftops just like yours. No streets, no palace, no walls. Smoke drifts from the holes that lead down into people's living spaces, and everywhere you look the houses are touching shoulder to shoulder like a single organism made of clay and fire. There are no temples here, no kings, no fortresses. Yet thousands of people live together, share resources, raise children, and bury their dead under their own floors. It is around 8,000 years before our time, and you are standing above 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐾𝐒, the village that needed no rulers. This place, in the Konya plain of central Anatolia, should not have existed, at least not by the logic of later civilizations. With a population of several thousand, dense architecture and craft specialization, it looks like a city. But it lacks every feature we associate with hierarchy. There are no royal tombs, no monumental buildings, no central square of power. Each home is roughly the same size, built from the same materials, filled with similar tools and ornaments. There are no roads between them. People move across rooftops, entering their homes through openings in the ceiling. From above, it looks like an unbroken fabric of equality. When archaeologists first excavated Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, they assumed the evidence must be missing. Surely there had to be some chief, some priestly elite managing this complexity. But decade after decade of digging has failed to reveal one. Instead, what emerges is a portrait of a society organized by consensus, maintained not by authority but by shared ritual and memory. This was not a city-state. It was something stranger, a stable, self-regulating organism, functioning on cooperation alone. Each house in Çatalhöyük was its own world. People cooked, slept, and made tools in rooms plastered smooth and painted with ochre. On the walls they painted hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and abstract designs that may have carried symbolic meaning. Beneath the floors they buried their dead, layering the generations directly under the living space. Every family literally lived on top of its ancestors, creating a vertical memory of life and death that bound them to their homes. When a house became too full of the past, it was levelled, and a new one built atop its remains, sometimes with parts of the old structure incorporated. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, who directed the modern excavations, described this cycle as houses growing from houses. Over centuries, this layering created mounds tens of meters deep, human-built hills made not from stone monuments, but from the sediment of daily life. The architecture itself became the social structure, each home echoing the same design as the next. Equality wasn't enforced, it was literally built into the floor plan. But the real mystery is how such a large community maintained cohesion without leaders. The answer, as with so much in early human history, seems to lie in ritual. Inside many houses, archaeologists have found symbolic installations, bull skulls embedded in walls, plastered figurines of women, and sequences of painted hands and animal motifs. These were not temples in the formal sense, but private altars, small acts of spirituality distributed evenly across households. The sacred was everywhere, and no one controlled it. Some scholars interpret these finds as evidence of a society held together by shared belief rather than hierarchy. Instead of one temple for the many, there were thousands of small shrines for each family. In this way, spiritual power remained decentralized, preventing any one person or group from monopolizing ritual authority. If 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 was the monument to collective gathering, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 was the monument to collective autonomy. Life here required constant negotiation. Without streets, each household depended on its neighbours to access the rooftops and move through the settlement. Privacy was minimal and cooperation essential. To reach the outside world, you had to walk across other people's roofs. The architecture enforced empathy, or at least awareness. Conflict could not be isolated. It was visible, immediate, and disruptive to everyone. So daily life became a kind of social balancing act, where equality was both necessity and principle. And yet, even in this egalitarian fabric, signs of difference emerge. Some homes contained more elaborate wall paintings or larger collections of obsidian tools. A few show signs of hosting communal meals or gatherings, but these variations seem to reflect household reputation rather than formal hierarchy. Status earned through contribution, not coercion. In this way, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 might represent the first scalable model of human cooperation beyond kinship. People lived side by side not because of shared blood, but because of shared purpose. Genetic studies support this picture. Analysis of ancient DNA from 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 burials suggests that people buried within the same house were not necessarily close relatives. This means that households were social, not strictly biological units, clusters of chosen kin connected by ritual and shared labour. The old problem of inbreeding had been solved not just through mobility, but through culture. Even within a sedentary life, humans found ways to maintain diversity by reshaping what family meant. At a larger scale, the settlement's organisation hints at a subtle social contract. No individual house dominates, but all are aligned to similar orientations, suggesting collective planning. The consistent use of materials, pigments, and motifs across hundreds of structures implies communication between households, an aesthetic democracy perhaps, where decisions about design and ritual were collectively maintained. This was architecture as equality made visible. One of the most striking aspects of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 is the intimacy between life and death. Beneath every sleeping platform, human skeletons rest in fetal position, often painted with red ochre. Infants, adults, and elders share the same space, their bones layered under the living. Some skeletons were later exhumed, their skulls removed and plastered, perhaps to be displayed or passed among the living during ceremonies. These acts were not macabre, they were connective. The ancestors were not distant or abstract, they were literally part of the home. In this way, the memory of those who came before acted as the invisible foundation of social continuity. This constant intertwining of ritual and daily life may have replaced what hierarchy usually provides: stability. Without chiefs or kings to enforce rules, the people of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 built their order through shared memory. The repetitive nature of construction, house upon house, generation after generation, kept everyone anchored in the same collective rhythm. Life itself became a ritual of rebuilding, a form of social DNA that carried forward cooperation through habit rather than law. And yet, even equality carries weight. Living in a community of equals requires constant effort. There is no one to make final decisions, no authority to absorb conflict. The social contract must be renewed daily through action. In this sense, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 may have been both utopia and pressure cooker, proof that equality can work, but only through endless negotiation. The material record shows that these people were deeply skilled. They crafted obsidian blades sharper than surgical steel, traded materials across long distances, and developed early forms of textile weaving and ceramic art. But nowhere do we find symbols of dominance, no thrones, no sceptres, no fortifications. Even art was communal. Wall paintings were repainted over and over, often by different hands, layering time as they layered pigment. When the settlement finally declined around 7,000 years before our time, it left behind no evidence of conquest or collapse. It simply faded as new forms of settlement arose elsewhere, larger, more complex, and eventually hierarchical. But 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 remains a glimpse of what humans can be when cooperation outweighs control. Archaeologists sometimes describe it as the egalitarian experiment, a social form that thrived for over 1,000 years without centralized power, and perhaps it lasted precisely because it grew from the same instinct that once drew people to 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, the need to belong, to connect, and to manage the delicate balance between isolation and over-closeness. Equality at this scale did not erase individuality. It made individuality collective. Each house mirrored the next, yet each was filled with the marks of its makers. Fingerprints pressed into plaster, bones carefully placed beneath the floor, paintings redone in new colours. Through these repetitions, humanity found a new kind of permanence, not in monuments, but in community itself. If 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 was where we first gathered, 𝐓𝐓𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 was where we first stayed, and stayed together. It shows that sedentary life did not have to begin with hierarchy. It could begin with memory, with cooperation, with the quiet agreement that survival was still a shared task. And maybe, deep down, that's the lesson buried beneath its walls, that equality is not an accident of small groups or primitive simplicity, but a conscious architecture, one that humans built, rebuilt, and carried forward until the world grew too complex to hold it. For 1,000 years they managed it. No kings, no armies, no slaves. Just people, their ancestors underfoot, and a horizon of rooftops where everyone could walk freely. Imagine this. You're standing on a small island off the coast of Brittany, France, around 7,000 years before our time. The tide has pulled back, exposing dark rock and salt-dusted sand, and scattered among the dunes are stones placed in careful circles. Between them lie shallow graves, some holding pairs, others groups of 3 or 4, their bodies arranged side by side and covered in shells. Around their bones there are necklaces of animal teeth, blades of flint, and beads of seashells that still faintly glimmer when the light hits them. None of these people were close relatives, and yet they were buried together, bound not by blood but by something older and perhaps more deliberate, a choice to make kin where there was none. These are the burials of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, small islands in Atlantic France that held some of the last Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Western Europe. When they were first excavated in the early 20th century, the graves puzzled archaeologists. Men and women, young and old, sometimes lay together under shared mounds. Some appeared to have died violently, others peacefully. The arrangements were intimate, as if those buried had shared deep connections in life. But the meaning of those connections remained a mystery until the 21st century, when genomic sequencing finally revealed the truth. Most of them were not related. The discovery came from a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024, which analysed the ancient DNA of 20 individuals buried at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒. The results were startling. Not only were these people genetically diverse, but their burial patterns seemed to reflect a structured social design, one that prioritised cooperation and exogamy over kinship. This was not a group of isolated families. It was a network of strangers choosing to live and die together. For decades, archaeologists assumed that prehistoric burial sites represented family groups. The logic was simple. Who else would bury you, tend to your body, and decorate your grave with care? But the people of the western Atlantic coast tell a different story, one where community extended beyond biology and where genetic diversity itself became a form of cultural survival. By the time of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, Europe was a patchwork of shrinking forager territories. The first farmers had begun to appear far to the east, but here along the ocean's edge, the old world still lingered, a maritime culture built on fishing, shell collecting and mobility. Populations were small and scattered, separated by rising seas and dangerous coastlines. Isolation should have led to inbreeding, yet the DNA tells us it did not. Somehow, these groups maintained healthy genetic variation for centuries. The implication is extraordinary. They had rules for this. The genetic data show that the buried individuals were drawn from multiple lineages, likely brought together through intermarriage and exchange. The researchers found no evidence of close-kin pairs, no parents with children, no siblings. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of intentional mixing. The people buried side by side were socially close, but genetically distant. In other words, kinship had become cultural, not biological. This is one of the earliest clear examples of social engineering for survival. When natural selection favoured diversity, culture provided the mechanism. It seems that the hunter-gatherers of Atlantic Europe had already developed sophisticated systems of alliance, perhaps through arranged partnerships or seasonal gatherings that allowed distant groups to meet and exchange both mates and information. The result was a society that used ritual and burial to formalize those relationships, cementing cooperation through the symbolism of shared death. One grave at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 contains two women laid head to head, their skulls adorned with elaborate shell headdresses and surrounded by weapons. Another contains a man and woman interred side by side, covered in red ochre, with antler tools and flint blades arranged as offerings. These are not random burials. Each pair tells a story of connection, bonds strong enough to warrant shared memory, even if not shared genes. The arrangement of the graves themselves also hints at communal identity. At 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, burials cluster in small groups beneath low stone circles, suggesting a pattern of repeated use by the same social unit, perhaps a band or clan, over generations. Yet genetic diversity within each cluster remained high. That means these groups continually absorbed outsiders, integrating them into both life and ritual space. Each mound becomes a record of social renewal, the dead arranged as evidence of unity through difference. The study's authors proposed that this anti-inbreeding system reflects one of the defining features of Homo sapiens, our ability to turn cultural behaviour into genetic strategy. Where biology creates limitations, culture builds bridges. In this sense, the graves of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 are not merely funerary monuments. They are the fossilized traces of social intelligence. These people understood, at least implicitly, that survival required connection, not just emotional, but reproductive. Archaeological evidence reinforces this interpretation. The grave goods at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 are remarkably uniform. Same materials, same decorative techniques, same level of craftsmanship for both sexes and all ages. There are no signs of status differences or wealth disparities. If hierarchy existed, it was invisible in death. This social symmetry mirrors what we saw earlier at Çatalhöyük, a world where cooperation and equality were not naive ideals but necessary technologies. Even the violence at these sites seems to tell a communal story. Some skeletons bear marks of arrows or blunt trauma, suggesting occasional conflict, yet those same individuals received careful burial and ornamentation. Death, even violent death, did not erase belonging. It might even have deepened it, the act of burial transforming loss into shared identity. To understand how radical this was, we can compare it to earlier burial sites across Eurasia. In Upper Paleolithic cemeteries like Sunghir, burials were lavish but selective. A few individuals received elaborate goods, hinting at emerging inequality. By contrast, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 suggest a return to balance, a late echo of hunter-gatherer egalitarianism at the edge of a changing world. The ocean may have isolated them, but it also preserved a social logic that prioritized group resilience over dominance. In practical terms, maintaining such cooperation across fragmented islands would have required regular contact, perhaps through seasonal voyages along the coast. The shells found in the graves include species from distant shores, evidence of exchange networks stretching hundreds of kilometres. These were seafaring societies, linked by ritual and reciprocity. The sea that separated them also united them. The presence of shared ornament styles across sites strengthens this interpretation. Similar headdresses, necklaces and decorative motifs appear not just in Brittany, but along the western coasts of France and even into the British Isles. Culture travelled with people, and so did genes. What we see at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 is part of a larger Atlantic network of communication, where mobility and ritual kept human populations genetically diverse and socially coherent. One could imagine these gatherings as proto-festivals, periodic assemblies where food, materials and marriage partners were exchanged. Over time, these events may have acquired spiritual meaning, blending biology and belief. Burial together, then, was the final affirmation of belonging, a symbolic act saying, "You were one of us, even if you were not one of ours." Such cooperation was not inevitable. The Mesolithic was an age of environmental change, melting glaciers, rising seas, shifting coastlines. As territories shrank, competition could easily have turned violent. That it did not, or at least not entirely, speaks to the strength of these social systems. The Atlantic hunter-gatherers were adapting not just biologically, but behaviourally, creating flexible structures that allowed survival through inclusivity. And perhaps, in a quiet way, this inclusivity was sacred. The circular stone mounds and shell ornaments suggest ritual, not mere practicality. To place a stranger beside you in death requires trust, and acceptance that kinship can be chosen. In that sense, these communities may have invented one of the earliest forms of symbolic citizenship. To be buried in the circle was to be part of the story. It is tempting to imagine the ceremonies that might have accompanied these burials. The gathering of people from neighbouring islands, the songs over the graves, the careful placement of beads and ochre. We will never know their words, but we can feel their logic. Where bloodlines ended, culture began. And in that moment, humanity became more than family. The people of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐿 lived in a world poised between eras, the last foragers of Western Europe, soon to be followed by farmers and megalith builders. Yet they already carried within them the social tools that would define our species: cooperation across distance, empathy beyond kinship, and to turn shared ritual into genetic resilience. When you look at their graves today, surrounded by the whisper of waves and wind, you can almost sense the pattern repeating. Small groups bound together, not by ancestry but by agreement. They were designing society one burial at a time, building circles that outlasted their bloodlines. And maybe that's what the stones remember, that the real miracle of early humanity was not invention or conquest, but the decision to stay connected even when the tides rose and the land began to disappear. A quiet peninsula somewhere along the western edge of Europe, around 6,500 years before our time. The tide has just gone out. Seaweed clings to the rocks, the wind hums low, and a group of hunter-gatherers moves carefully between stones that mark the resting places of their dead. They are not visiting ancestors in the way we might think. Some of the people buried here share no blood with them. They were strangers once, perhaps travellers from a distant bay, or the children of guests who stayed one season and never left. Yet here they rest, under the same shell mounds, wrapped in the same ochre, guarded by the same sea. Somewhere between survival and ritual, something quietly astonishing had happened. Humans had begun to build families out of choice, not out of lineage. For most of the time our species has existed, blood defined belonging. It was biology that kept a band alive, and it was familiarity that bred trust. The risk of inbreeding was managed through instinctive avoidance, dispersing at adolescence, pairing with outsiders when the opportunity arose. But kinship itself remained the spine of early human life. Then slowly something changed. Archaeology now suggests that in parts of late Mesolithic Europe, being human began to mean more than being someone's offspring. It began to mean belonging to an idea, a collective memory that outlived flesh. The genetic studies of burial sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐿, as well as Champigny on the French mainland, reveal that many individuals interred side by side were not biologically related. Some pairs show no genetic overlap at all, and yet they were buried together with care, adorned with shared symbols. placed in symmetrical positions as though to mirror equality in death. These are not the traces of random accidents or desperate mingling. They speak of systems, intentional, enduring, and meaningful. This is what scientists now call symbolic kinship, a structure that mimics family without requiring genetic inheritance. It's a leap as profound as the first tool or the first language, because it signals a shift from the natural to the cultural, from what we are to what we imagine ourselves to be. Once humans could extend kinship to non-relatives, they could extend cooperation, empathy, and trust as well. The web of human society became elastic, and that elasticity may have been the very thing that carried our species through isolation, famine, and climate chaos. In the burial circles of Western Europe, we see this system fossilized. The dead were grouped not by DNA, but by design. Each individual, whether adult or child, was integrated into a pattern of remembrance that reflected social rather than genetic identity. To be buried together was to share a narrative, not a genome. It was a form of citizenship, defined by ceremony instead of ancestry. That shift rippled through every layer of life. Cooperation became easier when kinship could be imagined. Grief became communal, no longer limited to the small circle of genetic family. Mourning a stranger became possible, perhaps even sacred, because the community itself had become the new organism, its survival transcending individual bloodlines. Archaeologists studying these burials describe uniformity in grave goods, equal effort and ornamentation across genders and ages. There are no clear hierarchies in wealth or rank. The shells, beads, and flint points seem to have been chosen less for who the person was, and more for what the group believed should accompany a member of their collective. That kind of equality does not arise accidentally. It reflects a shared understanding that all who lived together, regardless of ancestry, shared the same end. This was not a rejection of family, but an expansion of it. Biological kin remained important for child rearing and resource distribution, but symbolic kinship allowed for alliances across space and time. It let small groups merge, split, and reform without collapsing under genetic homogeneity. It also created a social safety net. If your blood family was lost, there was still a place for you, still hands to dig your grave and voices to remember your name. Anthropologists have found echoes of this pattern in modern hunter-gatherer groups that preserve ancestral social logics. Among the Hadza of Tanzania or the Australian Aboriginal clans, kinship is often fictive, based on ritual ties or shared totems rather than DNA. A person may be called mother, brother, or uncle, not because of birth, but because of the role they fulfill. What we see in Mesolithic Western Europe may be one of the earliest archaeological expressions of that same idea, the deliberate construction of belonging through shared symbols. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, a woman was buried with a child to whom she bore no genetic relation. Yet both were covered in the same red ochre and shell beads, their bodies arranged as if asleep beside one another. Perhaps she was a caretaker, or perhaps the symbolism was larger, a representation of continuity between generations, chosen rather than inherited. In a world where populations were thin and mortality constant, this flexibility in identity was life-saving. Symbolic kinship also required ritual reinforcement. Every burial, every ochre stain, every shared ornament was a social contract, a promise renewed through repetition. Over time, these acts would have accumulated into tradition, and tradition would have hardened into belief. When you treat non-relatives as family long enough, the distinction loses meaning. Cooperation becomes instinct. In that sense, these non-kin burials are not simply evidence of cultural complexity. They are the fingerprints of empathy. The people who created them had learned to extend compassion beyond immediate genetic self-interest. They had, quite literally, evolved social imagination. It's worth reflecting on how improbable this shift was. Most mammals cannot do this. Among chimpanzees and gorillas, alliances form largely within kin groups, and strangers are viewed as threats. Even among social primates, cooperation beyond family is rare and fragile. Humans broke that pattern, not through genetic mutation, but through symbolic behavior. Our brains learn to simulate kinship, to use language, ritual, and shared memory to turn unfamiliar faces into familiar ones. Some evolutionary theorists argue that this capacity for fictive kinship was the foundation for everything that followed: trade, marriage, religion, even politics. But here, at the end of the Mesolithic, it was still raw and personal, a handful of coastal foragers gathering around their dead, holding ceremonies that stitched together people from different bands and bloodlines, using ochre and shells as the vocabulary of belonging. And if you look closely, the details of these burials echo through later millennia. The idea that community transcends ancestry becomes the basis for clans, tribes, and eventually nations. The use of ornament and colour to mark membership persists in everything from uniforms to wedding rings. The impulse to bury the dead together, even when unrelated, continues in cemeteries today, silent descendants of the same social logic that took shape on those Atlantic shores. One could say that the Mesolithic foragers of Brittany invented a new kind of immortality, not through gods or monuments, but through memory embedded in community. They were no longer individuals passing through a bloodline. They were participants in a shared story. The body would decay, but the group remained. This transformation also reshaped how grief worked. To mourn someone without being related to them biologically is to recognize shared humanity as something deeper than blood. It may have been in those moments, beside the shallow graves, with the wind carrying salt and the smell of ochre, that humans began to feel the first stirrings of collective emotion, what we now call compassion. It's humbling to think that this emotional sophistication predates writing, farming, and kings. Before any of those appeared, people already knew how to belong to one another in ways that defied biology. They had learned to build invisible architectures of trust, the earliest templates of civilization. And in a quiet way, this discovery may have been just as revolutionary as the control of fire or the invention of tools. Fire allowed us to share warmth. Symbolic kinship allowed us to share meaning. When the archaeologists at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 brush the sand away from those intertwined skeletons, they are not just uncovering ancient bones. They are touching the moment when humanity began to transcend its own genes. A moment when love, duty, and community became choices, fragile, deliberate, and astonishingly durable. Perhaps that is why the graves are circular. The circle was not just a shape of convenience, it was a symbol of inclusion, of wholeness without centre. Everyone fits somewhere along its curve, and in that shape lies one of the oldest lessons our species ever learned, that the boundaries of family can be drawn by the heart as much as by the blood. A sun-baked plain in what will one day be called Upper Mesopotamia, 6,000 years before our time. A crowd gathers around a series of stone basins sunk into the earth. Inside them, water and crushed barley are beginning to bubble. The air smells faintly sweet, the yeast invisible, the reaction ancient. No one here knows the word fermentation, yet they know the sound of it, the hiss of life rearranging itself. They dip clay cups into the froth and pass them along a circle of people who speak different dialects but share one common thing, the warmth in the chest that follows a swallow. It is the same warmth that once sealed alliances, marriages, and peace. But now something subtle has shifted. The drink no longer belongs to everyone. The stone basins do. Archaeologists trace the first controlled brewing back to the same world that gave us the earliest monumental architecture, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, Karahan-Tepe, and the neighbouring settlements of the Fertile Crescent. Excavations there revealed stone troughs lined with barley residues and calcium oxalate, a telltale trace of fermentation. These were not household containers, they were communal vats. The people who built the circles of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 gathered seasonally, hunting, feasting, and drinking together. For over 1,000 years, fermentation had been a social technology, a way to bind different bands and bloodlines through shared intoxication, a ritual that kept exogamy and cooperation alive. But as population density grew and the settlements stopped moving, the same process that once dissolved hierarchy began to ferment something else. Fermentation is control disguised as chaos. Yeast consumes sugar, releasing alcohol and carbon dioxide, turning abundance into scarcity. To make it work predictably, someone must monitor temperature, grain, and timing. The earliest brewers likely realised that consistency meant authority. If you knew how to coax beer out of barley, people came to you. At first, this knowledge was ritual, perhaps a gift of the ancestors or spirits, but it gradually became property. The vats at 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 required collective labour to fill and clean, yet the act of brewing was limited to a few initiates. Over time, that separation between those who drink and those who manage the drink became the first quiet border between classes. By the 5th millennium before our era, this border solidified in the temple economies of southern Mesopotamia. At sites like Eridu and later Uruk, archaeologists find clay tablets engraved with tallies of barley deliveries and beer rations. The beverage that once united wandering clans had become an instrument of redistribution. The temple stored the grain, the priests oversaw fermentation, and the workers received measured portions, sometimes as wages, sometimes as offerings. What had begun as a feast of equals had turned into an administration of thirst. It is not that the people suddenly grew greedy. The shift was biological and social at once. Beer was a stable way to consume grains without spoiling, a mild antiseptic in a warm climate, and a calorie-dense liquid for labourers. Managing it efficiently required organisation, and organisation once established rarely stays neutral. The same communal troughs that had once invited anyone to drink now required record-keeping, measurement, and rules. Where once strangers had gathered to avoid inbreeding, now citizens gathered to obey calendars and quotas. Archaeologists have even found the impressions of cylindrical seals showing brewers at work under temple supervision. Around them appear cuneiform signs meaning barley, ferment, and beer. These are among humanity's first written words. Writing, in a sense, begins with intoxication control, a way to track who receives how much of a sacred substance. The social software of beer became the operating system of civilization. If that sounds cynical, it's only because the transformation was so complete. To the people themselves, it likely felt like order replacing chaos. The gods, newly named, were pleased. The priests ensured the cosmic recipe stayed unbroken. Festivals still occurred, but their scale required central storage and planning. Feasting became an extension of management. The old freedom of seasonal gatherings, where marriage and exchange occurred through shared joy, gradually turned into state rituals, where participation was granted through allegiance. The yeast still worked its unseen magic, but now the froth rose inside jars stamped with symbols of ownership. Chemical analyses of residues from later Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites, like Godin Tepe in Iran and Tel Bram in Syria, show the spread of standardized brewing across the Near East. Everywhere the pattern repeats, first communal, then controlled. Some anthropologists describe this transition as the domestication of yeast coinciding with the domestication of humans. We settled, and so did our microbes. Both learned to thrive inside systems that demanded predictability. Yet fermentation retained its double nature. It was still unpredictable enough to seem divine. When a batch soured or exploded, it was a warning from unseen forces. When it succeeded, it was a blessing. This tension made beer a perfect bridge between religion and administration. It justified authority as sacred necessity. Only the initiated could ensure the right conditions. Only the temple could guarantee the god's share. The communal gift became a ritual tax. The Sumerians recorded hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, describing each step of the process in reverent poetry. You are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who holds with both hands the great sweet wort. These lines reveal awe, not cynicism. People still saw beer as life itself, a living transformation of grain and water into something more than sustenance. But beneath the hymn lies an economic truth. The goddess's work had become institutional. Her hands were those of the temple women, the brewery servants, the accountants tallying jars. Through this slow alchemy, the biological ritual of exogamy, the old gatherings meant to mix genes and cultures, mutated into economic ritual, meant to mix goods and obligations. The genetic networks that once kept humanity diverse were replaced by bureaucratic ones that kept societies stable. In a sense, fermentation had always been about managing chaos, and hierarchy was simply its next logical form. It's tempting to imagine the first people who noticed the change. Perhaps an elder remembered the open circles of Göbekli Tepe, the laughter around shared basins, and now saw queues forming before temple gates. The yeast still smelled the same, but the meaning had curdled. What was once a festival of belonging became a ceremony of control. The drink that once ensured survival through unity had learned another purpose, obedience through intoxication. But even within that new order, traces of the older world persisted. Beer rations were communal. Everyone still drank from the same brew. The difference was who poured it. Hierarchy, like fermentation, never stops. It only shifts from one vessel to another. When we look back at these layers of stone, residue, and clay tablets, we are not just tracing an economic invention. We are witnessing a psychological transformation. Humanity had learned that resources could replace relationships, that ritual could enforce structure as effectively as kinship once had. The emotional warmth that fermented between strangers in a circle was now distilled into symbols pressed into wet clay. Perhaps that is why the myth of the first city often feels nostalgic rather than triumphant. Somewhere beneath the foundations of Uruk lies the ghost of a feast, the memory of a night when no one kept count, when barley and water met by accident and turned into something miraculous, shared without measure. Civilization did not erase that memory, it bottled it. What remains most fascinating is that the very process which birthed inequality also preserved cooperation. Beer still brought people together, temples still functioned as social hubs. The difference was that now inclusion required structure. To drink was to participate in an organised cosmos, where every jar mirrored a hierarchy, every sip acknowledged an order of gods, priests and labourers. Humanity's oldest communal ritual had become the architecture of civilization itself, and yet fermentation never truly obeys. Even the most controlled batch can bubble too hard, overflow, and remind its makers that life resists containment. That small defiance, the unpredictable breath of yeast, may explain why feasting, celebration, and shared intoxication never lost their ancient emotional power. Beneath the accounts and symbols, something older kept whispering that once, long ago, we brewed not for power but for reunion. The sun is rising over a river that has no name yet, its banks are lined with reeds and the smell of clay drying in the heat. A few thousand people move between huts, workshops, and granaries, carrying jars marked with small wedge-like impressions. In one of them, a scribe presses a stylus into wet clay. Barley, cattle, textiles, but also names. They are not just keeping track of things, they are keeping track of people. The lines of exchange that once bound distant hunter bands through marriage and ritual have now become roads, contracts, and treaties. Civilization at its core is still trying to solve the same problem its ancestors faced under the stars of the Ice Age: how to stay connected without collapsing in on itself. By the time we reach the middle of the 4th millennium before our time, the scattered settlements of the Fertile Crescent have turned into something new: proto-cities. Uruk in Mesopotamia, Hierakonpolis in Egypt, Susa in Elam, and Mehrgar in the Indus Valley. Across these distant regions, humans who had once lived as isolated foraging bands were now part of networks that stretched hundreds of kilometres. Traders carried obsidian, copper, lapis lazuli, and stories. With each journey, they also carried genes. Anthropologists call this the Great Demographic Smoothing, the moment when humanity's once fractured genome began to knit itself back together. Urbanization did not erase the biological logic of exogamy, it industrialized it. The same impulse that led our Mesolithic ancestors to bury strangers together now led city-states to forge alliances. Marriages between clans became treaties. The exchange of brides became the exchange of goods, hostages, and envoys. Genetic diversity had become diplomacy. Where once a coastal band in Brittany might have voyaged across the bay to find new mates, now kings sent daughters across deserts to secure peace. Ancient DNA supports this pattern. Studies from early Bronze Age cemeteries in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Indus region reveal an influx of mixed ancestry during this period. Populations that had once been genetically distinct, Zagros herders, Levantine farmers, Anatolian cultivators, began blending at unprecedented scale. Trade routes were the arteries of this new organism, and every caravan or river convoy was also a flow of genes. But here's the subtlety. It wasn't random mixing. The cities that rose during this era institutionalized connection. The temple storehouses, once centers of brewing and tribute, became administrative hubs for organizing marriages, labor, and travel. Cuneiform tablets list ration distributions to workers from foreign lands, coded evidence of integration. Early writing at its simplest was not literature but logistics, the bureaucratic skeleton that allowed humanity's old biological need for exchange to scale up without chaos. In other words, writing itself may have been a kind of genetic memory, an externalized brain keeping track of who belongs to whom, who owes what, who has the right to cross a border or marry into a house. Once, kinship lived inside the mind. Now, it lived on clay. Civilization was an external nervous system built to manage diversity. It's worth pausing here, because this is the quiet brilliance of our species. We found a way to turn biological necessity into social complexity. When population size made instinct unreliable, we invented institutions to do what evolution had done automatically. A hunter-gatherer band only needed a few dozen minds to remember the rules of kinship. A city of 10,000 needed archives. Archaeological layers from around 3,500 years before our time show the marks of this cognitive leap everywhere. At Uruk, token systems evolve into tablets bearing symbols that record names, exchanges, and lineages. In Egypt, clay ceilings with family emblems begin to appear on storage jars and tombs. In the Indus Valley, seals with animal motifs and abstract marks suggest systems of recognition, a visual grammar of belonging that transcended language. Every symbol was a miniature peace treaty, a reminder that cooperation had become too large for memory alone. The old feasting grounds that once brought strangers together once a year had transformed into permanent markets. The gods that once demanded offerings for fertility now received offerings for stability. Underneath it all, the biological rhythm persisted: movement, mingling, recombination. The Neolithic problem of inbreeding had been solved not through chance, but through bureaucracy. Even warfare, as grim as it was, served the same evolutionary function. When city-states clashed, they often sealed the aftermath with marriage or trade. Captives were absorbed, alliances reforged, and populations mixed again. Genetic studies of early dynastic Mesopotamia reveal lineages of surprising diversity, evidence that conquest and diplomacy alike acted as engines of hybridization. From a biological standpoint, civilization might be seen as the grandest exogamy network ever built. Instead of individuals choosing partners from neighboring bands, entire regions began exchanging their people in structured cycles. Over generations, these patterns reshaped humanity's genome, smoothing out regional bottlenecks that had persisted since the Pleistocene. The descendants of farmers, foragers, and herders were no longer isolated experiments in survival. They had merged into a species-wide collaboration. The tools of that collaboration, tokens, seals, archives, became the first forms of cultural inheritance separate from DNA. When people began recording who traded with whom, they were, unknowingly, writing the cultural equivalent of genetic recombination. The clay tablet and the chromosome are both carriers of history, both systems for preventing collapse through repetition and renewal. Yet, there is something almost tragic about this success. The intimacy of small band life, the shared ritual of avoiding inbreeding by meeting strangers in the wild, had become abstract. The new peace treaties were signed between rulers who might never meet the people they protected. Empathy had scaled, but at the cost of immediacy. Humanity had invented systems that could connect millions, but few would ever feel the warmth of those connections directly. Still, the underlying pattern held. When you strip away the bureaucracy, the temples, the walls of Uruk, or the pyramids of Egypt, what remains is a continuity of purpose. Civilization was not born to dominate nature, as we sometimes tell ourselves. It was born to preserve variation. It was a vast social algorithm for keeping humanity's genome healthy, for preventing the narrowing that almost erased us 100,000 years before. Consider this. Every trade route was a genetic bridge, every migration wave a corrective pulse against isolation. From obsidian in Anatolia to copper in Oman, goods travelled alongside people, and people alongside genes. Archaeogenetic models now show that even as early as 5,000 years before our time, there was measurable gene flow from the Caucasus into southern Mesopotamia, and from the Indus Valley westward into Iran. No empire could have planned it consciously, but collectively, we were performing what nature had demanded all along: cross-pollination through contact. The clay tablets of early cities record it in their own way. The same signs that mean grain and silver are used in administrative contexts for bride price and dowry. In a world without borders as we know them, such entries were more than economics. They were biological strategy encoded in bureaucracy. When two houses traded daughters, they traded futures. From this perspective, even the mythic concept of peace changes meaning. Peace was not just the absence of war. It was the resumption of mixing. A truce was an agreement to exchange again. Goods, ideas, and genes. The first recorded treaties, carved into stone around the late 3rd millennium before our time, are extensions of a pattern that began long before writing, the promise that cooperation ensures survival. One of the oldest, the treaty between the Sumerian cities of Lagash and Umma, simply established shared boundaries and obligations, but implicit within that inscription is the same logic that once governed small foraging networks: balance the flow, prevent isolation, keep contact alive. What looks like politics was, at its root, biology written in cuneiform. Perhaps that is the secret continuity between the Ice Age feasts and the Bronze Age cities, the same genetic peace treaty written first in gestures, then in symbols, then in stone. Humanity learned to outsource its survival instinct into culture, to replace random encounter with deliberate connection. Every wall built was also a gate, every law a protocol for maintaining diversity. And in this quiet evolutionary sense, civilization might not be the opposite of nature, but its masterpiece, an organism learning to manage its own complexity. The clay tablets of Uruk, the trade routes of Sumer, the river ports of Egypt, they were not merely the infrastructure of economy. They were the long echo of an ancient instinct whispering through the genome: never stay too small, never stop reaching outward. Because somewhere deep in our biology, the lesson remains the same as it was when strangers first met on a windswept plain. Survival depends on mixing, and peace, at its most honest, is just another word for connection. You reach out your hand, to greet, to comfort, to connect, and somewhere in that simple gesture echoes a memory older than civilization. A memory of strangers meeting beside firelight tens of thousands of years ago, exchanging food, glances, or words that would one day become promises. Every handshake, every shared meal, every cross-cultural friendship carries the faint ghost of something that once decided whether our species would live or die, because at least once in our deep past, strangers saved us. When we look at ourselves today, billions of us scattered across continents, speaking thousands of languages, carrying countless combinations of genes, it's hard to remember how fragile that diversity once was. There was a time when the number of living humans could fit inside a small town. Our survival was not inevitable. It depended on an unlikely strategy: connection. Not strength, not dominance, not purity, but the ability to reach beyond the familiar. Every discovery in genetics and archaeology keeps returning to this same truth. From the small bands of hunter-gatherers who met across Ice Age valleys, to the first traders navigating rivers lined with reeds, humanity survived through mingling. The faces that seem so different today, pale, dark, freckled, golden or olive, are all the aftershocks of those ancient meetings. Diversity is not a side effect of civilization. It is civilization. Our genomes still carry signatures of those choices, traces of mixing between distant groups, evidence of people who risked leaving their kin to find others. In every cell of our bodies, fragments of that story are still being told. The ability to cooperate with the unfamiliar, to empathize with someone who does not share your blood, may be the most successful adaptation our species ever evolved. And it was never guaranteed. For most of prehistory, humans were a story on the edge of extinction. Small populations, isolated, threatened by climate, famine, and geography. Inbreeding left genetic scars that scientists can still read in ancient bones. But each time we approached the brink, connection saved us. A migration, a meeting, a shared language, or a ritual brought distant bands together and renewed the thread. Over and over, culture performed the work of evolution, maintaining diversity by choice, not by chance. We can trace that pattern through the archaeological record like a pulse, in the burials of the Mesolithic coast, where non-relatives were laid side by side. In the feasting grounds of the Neolithic, where strangers gathered to exchange mates, goods, and stories. In the temple archives of early cities, where treaties replaced bloodlines and trade replaced kinship. The scale changed, but the logic never did. Cooperation equals survival. If you could zoom out far enough, beyond cities, beyond empires, beyond nations, you would see humanity as a vast network of crossing paths, constantly rewiring itself. Every migration out of Africa, every ship that sailed across the Indian Ocean, every caravan that crossed the steppe, every refugee who found shelter in an unknown land, all of them are part of the same recursive act. The pattern repeats. Isolation breeds decline. Connection restores life. Perhaps that's what makes our species different. Other animals can cooperate, even form alliances, but only humans learn to turn strangers into kin through imagination. We invented symbols, language, and shared stories so powerful they could make unfamiliar people feel familiar. That ability, to simulate belonging before it exists, is what allowed us to scale beyond the village, to build worlds of cooperation larger than the limits of memory. And yet, for all our progress, that ancient algorithm still hums quietly beneath everything we do. It lives in our biology and in our behaviour. We're drawn to one another, not just romantically, but socially, intellectually, emotionally. We seek diversity because something in us remembers that sameness was once dangerous. Even when we divide, there is an echo of longing for reunion. Look at the modern world through that lens, and it begins to make a strange kind of sense. The global web of travel, migration, and digital communication is the latest form of that instinct, an unstoppable drive to connect, to share, to mix. The internet, for all its noise and chaos, is a biological expression of the same survival mechanism that once brought strangers together in the Ice Age. It's the global-scale continuation of the genetic peace treaty that began when two ancient groups met by a river and decided not to kill each other. Of course, connection still carries risk. Cooperation has always balanced between generosity and exploitation, empathy and control. The same instinct that birthed equality also built hierarchies. The same sharing that once ensured survival now fuels consumption. But even so, the core behaviour remains. The world only stabilises when the flow continues. When we stop connecting, cultures ossify, populations stagnate, empathy shrinks, history punishes isolation. And maybe that's the quiet lesson buried inside our DNA, that connection isn't just sentimental, it's structural. We are built to need one another. The survival of our species was never about the fittest individual, but the most interwoven group. Every breakthrough, art, agriculture, science, emerged not from isolation, but from exchange. When scientists sequence ancient genomes today, they find evidence that our ancestors were constantly moving, mingling, blending. The boundaries between groups were never as fixed as we imagine. Even Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens were part of that pattern, hybridizing, learning from one another, ensuring neither lineage vanished without leaving something behind. The human story has never been one of purity, but of synthesis. That's why modern diversity, genetic, cultural, linguistic, isn't something to tolerate, it's something to protect. It's the living memory of our survival. Each difference is a data point in the experiment that worked. Every language, every tradition, every face adds redundancy to the system, ensuring that no single crisis can erase us all. Diversity isn't decoration, it's resilience. When we say we, what we really mean is a billion-year-old habit of coexistence. Microbes in our gut, oxygen from trees, food from soil, and love from strangers. The human genome itself is a record of millions of collaborations that outlived fear. Civilization in that sense is not a triumph over nature, but an extension of it. We are nature learning to recognize itself across faces. It's humbling to think that the empathy we call morality may have started as biology, a genetic safeguard against extinction that evolved into ethics. To care for the unfamiliar was once a survival strategy. Today is what keeps civilization from unraveling. The ancient handshake between bands became treaties, laws, human rights, and eventually compassion itself. So the next time you walk through a crowded city, hearing dozens of languages, seeing faces from every corner of the planet, remember that what you're witnessing is not chaos. It's success. It's the outcome of 100,000 years of deliberate mixing, the living continuation of the peace treaty our ancestors began. Every stranger you pass is, in a very literal sense, your distant relative, the result of countless acts of cooperation that kept the human experiment alive. Science doesn't claim to have all the answers about where this pattern leads, but it shows us the shape of the past, that every time we reached outward instead of inward, the world expanded and life endured. Maybe the most important story we've ever told is not about gods or kings, but about the fragile thread of connection itself, how we learned, again and again, that survival begins with the courage to trust someone new. And as you listen to these words, whether you're lying awake, driving through the night, or sitting quietly in your own small corner of the world, remember that the same ancient network still includes you. Every friendship, every act of empathy, every conversation across distance is a small continuation of that lineage. It's what keeps us human, even in a world that feels increasingly mechanical. Because long before we built walls, we built bridges. And if we ever forget how to cross them, the story that began 100,000 years ago may finally end. But if we remember, if we keep reaching out, then the strangers who once saved us might still be saving us now. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.